Welcome. The night has draped itself over the city in silence, and it is finally time to rest. I am NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, the story that will accompany you follows two young souls, Henry and Rose, as they strive to solve a mystery at the very heart of the world, the Triad Saga. Set your mind free, take a deep breath, and focus only on the flow of the narrative. As you lose yourself in the story, let sleep slowly embrace you. If you are ready, we begin our journey from the very first page. Henry stood in the middle of the town square. He carried a small suitcase in his right hand. The air was cool and the sky was grey. Henry was 30 years old, and he wanted a quiet life. For many years, he lived in a big, noisy city. He worked in a busy office with loud telephones and angry bosses. Now, he wanted something different. He wanted silence. He wanted books. He looked at a small paper in his hand. It was an advertisement for a job. It said, "Help wanted. Miller's Books. Quiet work for a serious person." Henry smiled. He felt like a serious person. He walked down a narrow street with stone walls. At the end of the street, he saw a dark green door. Above the door, a wooden sign moved slowly in the wind. It said Miller's Books in gold letters. Henry pushed the door. The wooden door made a long, high sound as it opened. Inside, the shop was very dark. It smelled like old paper, dried flowers, and floor wax. There were books everywhere. They were on the shelves, on the floor, and in tall piles on small tables. The ceiling was high, and the corners of the room were full of shadows. "Hello," Henry said. His voice was quiet, but it felt loud in the silent room. An old man walked out from behind a tall shelf of history books. He was thin and wore a brown sweater. He had white hair and very sharp blue eyes. He looked at Henry for a long time. He did not smile. This was Mr. Miller. "You are late," Mr. Miller said. His voice was deep and dry. "I am sorry," Henry replied. "The bus was slow." Mr. Miller walked to a heavy wooden desk. He put his hands on a large, black book. "This is a serious place, Henry. People come here to find things. Sometimes they find stories. Sometimes they find facts. But they must always follow the rules." Henry nodded. "I understand, Mr. Miller. I like rules. I like order." Mr. Miller looked at Henry's suitcase. "You can live in the room above the shop. It is small, but it is dry. You will start now. There are many boxes in the back. They are full of books from an old house. You must put them on the shelves. Do not stop until the sun goes down." Henry took off his coat. He felt a strange energy in the room. The shop was quiet, but it did not feel empty. It felt like the books were watching him. He walked to the back of the shop. He saw a pile of heavy cardboard boxes. He opened the first one. Inside, the books were very old. Some had leather covers. Some were tied with pieces of string. As Henry worked, he felt happy. He touched the old pages. He liked the weight of the books in his hands. But he also felt a little bit nervous. The shop was very large, and the back of the store was very dark. Every time he moved a box, the floor made a soft, heavy sound. He felt like he was not alone, but when he looked around, he only saw the shadows of the shelves. The sun began to set. Long, orange shadows stretched across the floor of the bookshop. Henry finished the last box of history books. His hands were dusty, and his back was a little tired, but he felt a sense of pride. He looked around the shop. It was even more mysterious in the evening light. Mr. Miller appeared from the shadows. He did not make a sound when he walked. He carried a small, silver lamp. The light from the lamp made his face look like a mask of old paper. He looked at the shelves Henry had organized. He touched the spine of a book with a long, thin finger. "You work fast, Henry," Mr. Miller said. He did not sound happy, but he did not sound angry. He sounded like a man who was always thinking about something else. "Now, follow me. I will show you where you will sleep." They walked up a narrow, winding staircase at the back of the shop. The wood complained under their feet with deep, heavy sounds. At the top of the stairs was a small landing with 2 doors. Mr. Miller opened the first door. The room was simple. It had a bed, a small table, a chair, and one window that looked out onto the dark street. There was a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. "This is your space," Mr. Miller said. "But before you sleep, we must talk about the rules. This shop is not like other shops. It is very old, and the things inside are very important." Henry sat on the edge of the bed. Mr. Miller stood in the doorway, holding his lamp. "Rule number 1. Mr. Miller began. "The shop opens at 8 in the morning. It closes at 6 in the evening. When the door is locked, it stays locked. Do not open it for anyone, not even if they say it is an emergency." Henry nodded. "I understand. Security is important." Rule number 2. The old man continued. "You must never take a lamp or a candle into the basement. The air there is very dry, and the books are very old. Fire is our greatest enemy." "That makes sense," Henry said. Rule number 3. Mr. Miller's voice became lower and more serious. "There is a large shelf in the very back of the shop. It is covered with a heavy blue cloth. You must never move that cloth. You must never look at the books behind it. If a customer asks about them, you must say the books are already sold." Henry felt a shiver of curiosity. "Is there a reason why?" Mr. Miller looked Henry directly in the eyes. His gaze was cold. "The reason is that I am the owner, and you are the assistant. That is the only reason you need. Do you agree to these rules?" Henry looked at the small, quiet room. It was better than his loud apartment in the city. He wanted this job. "Yes, Mr. Miller. I agree." "Good," the old man said. He placed a heavy iron key on the table. "This is for the front door. Sleep now. Tomorrow, the real work begins." Mr. Miller turned and walked away. Henry heard his slow footsteps going down the stairs. The shop became silent again. Henry looked at the iron key. He wondered what was behind the blue cloth in the back of the shop. He knew he should not be curious, but the mystery was already growing in his mind. The next morning, Henry woke up early. The sun was pale and cold. He washed his face with cold water and went down the stairs. He felt the weight of the iron key in his pocket. At exactly 8 o'clock, he went to the front of the shop. He turned the heavy lock and pulled the door open. A light bell above the door made a soft, musical sound to announce the start of the day. For the first few hours, the shop was empty. Henry spent his time cleaning the dust from the shelves. He used a soft yellow cloth to wipe the covers of the books. He liked the names of the authors. Some names were famous, and some names were completely unknown to him. He found a section about local history and spent a long time looking at old photos of the town. At 11 o'clock, the door opened. The light bell sounded again. A woman walked into the shop. She was about 35 years old. She wore a long, dark green coat and a white scarf. Her hair was dark and wavy. She looked around the shop with a look of deep concentration. She did not look like a person who was just passing time. She looked like a person on a mission. Henry stood up from behind the desk. "Good morning," he said politely. Can I help you find something? The woman walked toward him. Her boots made a firm, rhythmic sound on the wooden floor. She stopped at the desk and looked at Henry. Her eyes were a very bright green, but they looked tired. "My name is Rose," she said. Her voice was steady but soft. "I am looking for a very specific book. It is a very old book about the history of the town's clock tower. The title is The Architecture of the Clock Tower." Henry thought for a moment. He remembered the history section he was just cleaning. "I was just in that section. Rose. Let me look again." Henry walked to the back of the room. Rose followed him. They stood in front of the tall wooden shelves. Henry ran his fingers over the spines of the books. He saw books about the town's founding, books about the local river, and books about the old families of the area. But he did not see a book about the clock tower. "It is not here," Henry said. "Are you sure about the title?" Rose sighed. She looked disappointed. "I am sure. My father told me about it many years ago. He said it was the most important book in this shop." Henry looked at the shelves again. Then, he looked at the very back of the shop. In the darkest corner, he saw the large shelf covered with a heavy blue cloth. He remembered Mr. Miller's rule. You must never move that cloth. "Is there another place for rare books?" Rose asked. She followed his eyes to the corner. "What is behind that blue cloth?" Henry shook his head quickly. "I am sorry, but those books are already sold. I cannot show them to you." Rose looked at the cloth for a long time. She looked like she wanted to say something, but she stopped. She turned back to Henry. "I see. Well, if you find any information about that book, please let me know. It is very important to my family." She gave him a small piece of paper with her phone number on it. Then, she turned and walked out of the shop. Henry watched her through the window. She stood on the sidewalk for a minute, looking up at the sky, before she disappeared around the corner. Henry felt a strange feeling in his chest. He felt like the mystery of the shop was just beginning. Henry was alone in the shop that afternoon. Mr. Miller went to the post office to send some letters. Before he left, he told Henry to stay near the desk. But Henry felt restless. He wanted to clean the shelves near the history section again. He felt that he missed something earlier. He went to the back of the room. He began to move some large books about old ships. As he moved a heavy volume, he saw a small gap between the wooden shelf and the stone wall. It was a dark, narrow space. Henry reached his hand into the gap. His fingers touched something cold and hard. He pulled the object out. It was a book, but it was not like the others. It was covered in a very thick layer of grey dust. Henry blew the dust away. The book was bound in dark brown leather. It felt very heavy for its size. Henry looked at the front cover. There were no letters or gold decorations. He looked at the spine. There was no title. It was a book with no name. Henry felt his heart beat faster. He walked back to the wooden desk and put the book down. A heavy, dull sound echoed through the silent room when the leather touched the wood. He opened the first page carefully. The paper was yellow and very thin. The writing was not printed by a machine. It was written by hand with a pen and dark ink. The handwriting was elegant, but the words were difficult to read. He turned the pages slowly. There were drawings among the words. He saw a detailed drawing of a large metal gear. On the next page, there was a drawing of a tall, thin building. It looked exactly like the town's clock tower. Henry remembered Rose. She was looking for a book about that tower. Could this be the book she wanted? But the title she mentioned was different. Suddenly, the front door opened. The light bell made its musical sound. Henry quickly closed the book. He felt a strange sense of guilt, as if he was doing something wrong. He looked up, expecting to see Mr. Miller. But it was not the owner. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall and wore a long, grey coat. He had a hat that was pulled down low, covering his eyes. The man did not move at first. He stood in the entrance and looked around the shop. His eyes moved over the shelves, then to the back of the room where the blue cloth was, and finally to Henry. "Can I help you?" Henry asked. He moved his hand to cover the untitled book on the desk. The man did not answer immediately. He walked to the center of the shop. His steps were heavy. "I am looking for Mr. Miller," the man said. His voice was deep and rough, like stones rubbing together. "He is out at the moment," Henry said, trying to stay calm. "He will be back soon. Do you want to leave a message?" The man in the grey coat looked at Henry's hand on the desk. He stayed silent for a moment. Then, without saying another word, he turned around and walked out of the shop. He did not say goodbye. Henry felt a cold shiver. He looked down at the leather book. He knew he had to hide it before Mr. Miller returned. Henry stood behind the desk for a long time. The shop was very quiet after the man in the grey coat left. Henry looked at the front door. Then he looked at the untitled book. He felt a mix of fear and curiosity. He knew he should put the book back in the gap in the wall. Mr. Miller was a serious man with strict rules. But Henry could not stop thinking about the drawings of the clock tower. He opened the book again. This time, he went deeper into the pages. The handwriting was very small. There were dates from many years ago. It looked like a diary or a secret record. As he turned a page near the middle of the book, he felt something thick. It was not a regular page. It was a piece of paper, folded 3 times. It was tucked between 2 pages that were stuck together with age. Henry pulled the paper out very carefully. He did not want to tear the old, dry paper. He unfolded it on the wooden desk. It was a map. The map was hand-drawn with black ink. Henry recognized the shapes immediately. It was a map of the town. He saw the main street, the narrow river, and the park. In the center of the map, there was a detailed drawing of the clock tower. But there were other marks, too. There were small X marks in different colors. One was near the river. One was near the town library. And one was exactly where the bookshop was located. Henry looked closer. At the bottom of the map, there was a name written in bright red ink. The ink looked different from the black ink on the map. It looked newer, though it was still old. The name was Silas. Henry whispered the name to himself. Silas. He did not know anyone in town with that name. Was it the man in the grey coat? Or was it someone from the past? He remembered the way the man in the grey coat looked at him. It was a look of someone who was searching for something. Suddenly, Henry heard a sound from the street. It was the sound of heavy boots on the sidewalk. Then, he heard the sound of a key in the front door lock. It was Mr. Miller. Henry's heart jumped. He quickly folded the map and put it back inside the book. He did not have time to go to the back of the shop to hide it in the wall. He opened a drawer in the desk and pushed the book inside. He closed the drawer just as the front door opened. Mr. Miller walked in. He carried a small bag of groceries. He looked at Henry. His blue eyes were sharp. He looked at the desk, then at Henry's face. "You look pale, Henry," Mr. Miller said. He walked toward the back of the shop. "Did something happen while I was away?" A man came to the shop. Henry said. He tried to keep his voice steady. "He was looking for you. He wore a grey coat and a hat." Mr. Miller stopped walking. He did not turn around. For a moment, he was completely still. "Did he say his name?" "No," Henry replied. "He just looked around and left." Mr. Miller turned his head slightly. "If he comes back, Do not speak to him. Just tell him I am busy. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Miller," Henry said. Mr. Miller walked up the stairs to his office without another word. Henry sat down. He could feel the weight of the book in the drawer. He knew he was now part of a secret, and there was no going back. The next day was very cold. A thick fog covered the streets of the town. Henry stayed inside the bookshop. He felt safe among the tall shelves and the smell of old paper. However, he could not stop thinking about the book in the desk drawer. He wanted to look at the map again, but Mr. Miller was always nearby. The old man moved like a ghost through the aisles. In the afternoon, the light in the shop was very dim. Henry was cleaning the front desk with his yellow cloth. Suddenly, he saw a shadow through the glass of the front door. It was a man. He was standing on the sidewalk, perfectly still. He wore a long, grey coat and a dark hat. It was the same man from the day before. He was not looking at the books in the window. He was looking directly at Henry. Henry felt a cold shiver. He tried to look busy. He picked up a book and began to read, but he could not focus on the words. He felt the man's eyes through the glass. After many minutes, the door opened. The light bell moved to announce a visitor. The man in the grey coat entered. He was very tall, and his coat was damp from the fog. He did not look at the shelves. He did not walk to the history section or the fiction section. He walked straight to the desk and stopped. He stood there and watched Henry. He did not say a word. "Good afternoon," Henry said. He tried to make his voice sound strong. "Are you looking for a specific book today?" The man did not answer. His eyes were dark and very hard. He looked at the desk. Then he looked at the drawers. Henry felt a surge of nervous energy. He hoped the drawer with the secret book was closed tightly. "You are the new assistant," the man said finally. His voice was deep and very slow. "Mr. Miller is getting old. He needs help to guard his treasures. I'm just here to organize the books," Henry replied. The man leaned forward. He was so close that Henry could smell the cold air on his coat. "This is a small town, Henry. People notice when something changes. They notice when a new person arrives. And they notice when someone finds something that was lost." "I don't understand what you mean," Henry said. The man smiled, but his eyes stayed cold. It was not a friendly smile. "I think you do. You have a curious face. But curiosity can be a problem in a place like this." The visitor did not move. He continued to watch Henry for a long time. He stayed so still that he looked like a statue. Henry felt very uncomfortable. He wanted to call for Mr. Miller, but he stayed silent. Finally, the man reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, black card and placed it on the wooden desk. "If you find anything unusual," the man whispered, "call me. It is better to have a friend like me than an enemy." He turned around and walked out into the fog. Henry looked at the card. There was no name. There was only a phone number written in white ink. He quickly put the card in his pocket. He felt like the shop was no longer a safe place. Henry sat behind the desk for a few minutes after the man in the grey coat left. He felt the small, black card in his pocket. It felt like it was burning against his leg. He looked at the drawer where the untitled book was hidden. He felt a strong need to see the map again. He wanted to understand why the man in the grey coat was so interested in this shop. He made sure the front door was locked. Then, he listened for Mr. Miller. He heard the sound of a teapot in the small kitchen upstairs. The old man was busy. Henry opened the drawer slowly. The leather book was there, dark and silent. He lifted it out and placed it on the desk. He opened the book to the middle. He looked at the hand-drawn map. He traced the lines with his finger. The X marks were so specific. Why was there an X on the bookshop? Was there something hidden under the floor? Or was the book itself the treasure? Suddenly, the air in the room changed. Henry felt a shadow fall over the desk. He looked up quickly. His heart skipped a beat. Mr. Miller was standing right in front of him. The old man did not have his lamp. He stood in the dim light of the afternoon, and his face was full of a dark, cold anger. Henry tried to close the book, but Mr. Miller reached out. His hand was surprisingly fast. He grabbed Henry's wrist with a very strong grip. "Where did you find this?" Mr. Miller asked. His voice was not a whisper anymore. It was sharp and dangerous. I found it behind a shelf, Mr. Miller." Henry stammered. "I was just cleaning. I didn't mean to." Mr. Miller pulled the book away from Henry. He held it close to his chest, as if it were a shield. His blue eyes were wide and full of fear. "I told you there were rules, Henry. I told you this was a serious place. This book is not for you. This book is not for anyone. I saw a map inside," Henry said, trying to be honest. "And a name. Silas." At the sound of the name, Mr. Miller's face went white. He stepped back and leaned against a tall stack of books. The books shifted slightly. "You must never speak that name," Mr. Miller whispered. He looked at the front door, then back at Henry. "And you must never touch this book again. Do you hear me? If you touch it, you put yourself in great danger. You put this whole shop in danger." "Who is Silas?" Henry asked. "Was he the man in the grey coat?" Mr. Miller shook his head. He looked very old and very tired now. "The man in the grey coat is just a shadow. Silas is the person who sends the shadows. If they know we have this book, they will not stop. They will come for it." Mr. Miller took the book and walked toward the back of the shop. He went to the large shelf covered with the heavy blue cloth. He lifted the corner of the cloth and pushed the leather book deep behind the other volumes. Then, he turned back to Henry. "Go to your room," Mr. Miller said. "Forget the map. Forget the man. If you want to stay here, you must be silent. This is your only warning." Henry did not say a word. He walked up the stairs to his small room. He sat on his bed and looked out the window at the fog. He knew Mr. Miller was trying to protect him, but he also knew it was too late. He had already seen the map. He already knew the secret was real. The night was very dark. Henry lay on his small bed, but his eyes were wide open. He looked at the ceiling. The town was silent, but Henry's mind was loud. He thought about the red name on the map. He thought about the man in the grey coat. Most of all, he thought about the deep fear in Mr. Miller's eyes. He looked at the iron key on the table. It was the key to the front door. He felt a strong pull toward the shop. He needed to see the blue cloth again. He needed to know if the leather book was still there. He felt that the book held the answer to why he was here. Henry stood up quietly. He did not put on his shoes. He walked to the door of his room and opened it slowly. The hallway was cold. He walked to the top of the stairs and looked down. The shop was a sea of black shadows. The smell of old paper was even stronger at night. It felt heavy in the air. He stayed very still. He listened for any movement. There was no sound from Mr. Miller's room. The old man was probably asleep. Henry began to walk down the stairs. Each step felt very long. He reached the bottom and stood in the middle of the shop. The silence was absolute. Suddenly, he heard a soft noise. It was the sound of a window sliding open. It came from the back of the shop, near the storage room. Henry froze. He did not have a lamp. He stayed in the shadows behind a tall shelf of poetry books. He saw a thin beam of light. It was a flashlight. The light moved across the floor. It moved up the shelves. It was searching for something. The light stopped on the large shelf in the back. It stopped exactly on the heavy blue cloth. Henry's heart beat very fast. He wanted to run, but he could not move. He watched the light. A hand reached out into the beam of light. It was a large hand with a heavy silver ring on one finger. The hand grabbed the blue cloth and pulled it down. The cloth hit the floor with a soft, heavy sound. Henry realized he was not the only person looking for the secret book. He moved a little bit to see the face of the stranger. As he moved, a piece of wood under his foot made a sharp sound. The beam of light immediately turned toward him. The light hit Henry directly in the eyes. He was blinded by the brightness. "Who is there?" A voice whispered. It was a cold, hard voice. It was not Mr. Miller. It was a voice Henry did not know. Henry turned and ran toward the front door. He reached into his pocket and found the iron key. He pushed the door open and ran out into the cold night air. He stopped on the sidewalk and looked back at the shop window. Inside, the light was still moving. It was moving fast now. Henry saw a shadow pass across the glass. Then, the light went out. The shop was dark again. Henry stood in the fog, shivering. He was alone on the street, and he was terrified. Henry stood in the cold fog for a long time. His hands were shaking. He watched the front window of the shop. There was no more light inside. There was no more movement. The silence was very heavy. He waited 5 minutes, then 10. Finally, he decided to go back inside. He could not stay on the street in his nightclothes. He opened the front door very slowly. He did not want to make a sound. The shop was dark and smelled like the night air. He walked to the back of the shop. He saw the blue cloth on the floor. It looked like a large, dark shadow on the wood. He looked at the shelf. The leather book was gone. The intruder found it. "Mr. Miller." Henry whispered. No one answered. Henry went to the stairs. He climbed them carefully. Each step made a small sound. He went past his own room and stopped in front of Mr. Miller's office. Usually, this door was always locked. Tonight, it was open. A small lamp was on inside the room. The light was very dim. Henry entered the office. It was a small room with many tall cabinets. In the corner, there was a large, grey metal safe. The heavy door of the safe was wide open. It looked like someone used a heavy tool to break the lock. There were papers everywhere. They were on the desk, on the chair, and on the rug. Henry picked up one piece of paper. It was an old list of names. Some names had lines through them. He saw the name Arthur, and the name Rose. Next to Rose's name, there was a small question mark. He looked inside the safe. It was empty. There was no money. Only a small, empty wooden box remained at the bottom. Henry felt a cold wind on his neck. He looked at the office window. It was open. The curtain was moving slowly in the wind. He realized the intruder did not leave through the front door. The intruder came up here to the office. "Mr. Miller." Henry called out more loudly. He ran to the owner's bedroom next door. He pushed the door open. The bed was empty. The blankets were on the floor. Mr. Miller was not there. Henry looked around the room. He saw a small, dark red mark on the white carpet near the door. He touched it with his finger. It was wet. Henry felt a wave of fear. He was alone in the big, dark shop. His boss was gone. The secret book was stolen, and the safe was empty. He needed to find help. He did not want to call the police yet because he did not know who to trust. He thought about the man in the grey coat. But then he remembered Rose. She was looking for the book too. Henry grabbed his coat and ran down the stairs. He went out the front door and locked it. He began to walk quickly toward the town square. He hoped Rose was still in town. The town square was empty and very quiet. The yellow light from the street lamps looked weak in the thick fog. Henry walked quickly. He kept his hands in his pockets. He felt the small piece of paper with Rose's phone number. He did not have a phone with him, so he looked for a public phone booth. He found one near the old park. He entered the booth and dialed the number. The phone rang many times. Finally, a woman answered. Her voice was full of sleep. "Hello," she said. "Rose, it is Henry," he said. He was breathing fast. "From the bookshop. Something terrible happened. Mr. Miller is gone, and someone took the book." There was a long silence. Then, Rose spoke. Her voice was now very sharp and awake. "Stay where you are, Henry. I am coming to you. Meet me in front of the town library in 5 minutes." Henry walked to the library. It was a large stone building across from the park. He waited under a tall tree. Soon, a small blue car arrived. The car stopped, and Rose climbed out. She looked very worried. She was wearing her green coat again, but her hair was messy. "Tell me everything," she said. Henry told her about the night visit, the man with the silver ring, the open safe, and the red mark on the carpet. Rose listened carefully. She did not look surprised. She looked sad. "I knew this would happen," she whispered. She looked at the dark windows of the library. "Henry, there is something I did not tell you yesterday. I am not just looking for a book about a clock tower. I am looking for my father's life." Henry looked at her. "Your father?" Rose nodded. 20 years ago, my father was the assistant at Miller's Books. His name was Thomas. He was a very smart man, and he loved old stories. One day, he found a secret. He began to write everything down in a leather book with no title. He told my mother that he found something under the town, something very old and very valuable. "The gold?" Henry asked, remembering the map. "Maybe," Rose said. But one night, he went to the shop to finish his work, and he never came home. The police looked for him, but they found nothing. No body, no clothes, nothing. Mr. Miller told the police that my father quit his job and left the town. But I never believed him. "So the book I found, that was your father's book?" Henry asked. "Yes," Rose replied. Tears were in her eyes. "Mr. Miller kept it all these years. He was protecting it. Or maybe he was hiding it. But now, the people who took my father have the book. They are dangerous, Henry. They are the same people who took Mr. Miller tonight." Henry looked at the dark streets. He felt a deep sense of responsibility. He was just a man who wanted a quiet life. But now he was in the middle of a 20-year-old mystery. "What do we do now?" Henry asked. Rose looked at the library door. "We follow the map. I remember the drawings from when I was a child. The first X was not at the shop. It was here, in the library. We need to go inside." The library was a silent giant in the fog. Its tall stone pillars looked like ghosts. Henry looked at Rose. He saw strength in her eyes, but he also saw a lot of pain. He realized that this was not just a mystery for her. It was her life. She wanted to find her father. Henry wanted to find the truth and help Mr. Miller. They were now a team. "We cannot go through the front door," Rose whispered. "The alarm is on, and the police will come. But my father once told me about a secret entrance for the workers." They walked around the side of the building. The grass was wet and cold against Henry's feet. They reached a small, heavy wooden door near the basement. It was hidden behind some thick bushes. Rose reached into her bag and pulled out a small set of metal tools. She worked on the lock for a minute. Her hands were very steady. A soft click sounded, and the door opened. Henry was surprised. "Where did you learn to do that?" "When you search for a missing person for 20 years, you learn many things. Rose said. She did not smile. They stepped inside. The air was warm and smelled like old glue and carpet. It was very dark. Henry followed Rose. They walked through a narrow hallway. Soon, they reached the main room of the library. It was huge. There were thousands of books on tall, dark shelves. The moonlight came through the high windows and made long, silver paths on the floor. "Wait," Henry said. He stopped near a large table. The map had an X here. But where? "This room is too big." Rose pulled a small flashlight from her pocket. She did not turn it on yet. "My father's journal mentioned a specific place. He called it the history of the silent." They began to search the rows. Henry looked at the labels on the shelves. He saw science, art, and music. Finally, he found the history section. It was in the oldest part of the building. The shelves were made of dark oak. "Here," Henry whispered. They looked at the books. Most of them were very thick and dusty. Rose turned on her light and moved it slowly over the titles. After a few minutes, she stopped. Her light was on a very thin, red book. It was placed between two very large volumes. There was no title on the red book, just a small symbol of a clock. "This is it," Rose said. Her voice was shaking. Henry reached out to take the book, but then he heard something. It was the sound of a heavy door opening far away. Then, he heard the sound of footsteps on the stone floor. They were slow and heavy. Someone else was in the library. "Hide," Rose whispered. They ducked behind a large desk. Henry held his breath. He looked through a small gap in the desk. He saw a beam of light moving across the room. The light was coming toward them. Henry felt his heart beating against his ribs. He hoped the stranger would not find them. He looked at the red book in Rose's hand. They had the first clue, but they were trapped. Rose and Henry stayed very still behind the large wooden desk. The stranger's light moved across the ceiling, then down to the floor. The sound of heavy boots on the stone was slow and steady. Henry looked at Rose. Her face was pale in the dim light, but her eyes were focused. She held the small red book tightly against her chest. The stranger was now very close to the history section. Henry could see his shadow on the wall. The shadow was very tall and wore a hat. It was likely the man in the grey coat, or one of his friends. The man stopped near the shelf where they found the red book. He made a low sound of anger when he saw the empty space on the shelf. Rose touched Henry's arm. She pointed toward a small door behind them. It was a door for the library staff. They began to crawl slowly. They moved like shadows across the dark carpet. Every time the stranger moved, they stopped. Finally, they reached the door and slipped inside. They were now in a small storage room. It was filled with old boxes, broken chairs, and rolls of carpet. The air was very dusty. Henry looked at the floor. He remembered the map he saw in the bookshop. The X for the library was not just for a book. It was for a location. He saw a large, heavy rug in the center of the room. It was covered in a thick layer of grey dust. No one had moved it for many years. Henry pointed at the rug. Rose understood. Together, they grabbed the edge of the rug. They pulled it back slowly. The rug was very heavy, and it made a soft, rubbing sound against the floor. Under the rug, there was a wooden floor. In the middle of the floor, Henry saw a square shape. It was a trapdoor. It had a small metal ring for a handle. Henry looked at Rose. "Should we go down?" He whispered. "We have to," Rose replied. "The man is still in the library. We cannot go back." Henry grabbed the metal ring. He pulled it up. The wooden door made a loud, high noise as it opened. It was the sound of old wood moving after a long time. They waited for a moment. They listened for the stranger. The library was silent, but they knew he heard the noise. They had very little time. Below the door, there was a set of narrow wooden stairs. They led down into a deep, black hole. The air coming from the hole was very cold and smelled like wet stone. Rose turned on her flashlight for a second to see the steps. "I will go first," Henry said. He stepped onto the first stair. It felt solid. He began to go down into the dark. Rose followed him and closed the trapdoor above their heads. Now, they were in total darkness. They were under the library, and they were alone in the silence of the earth. Henry and Rose were now in a deep space below the library. The air was very different here. It was thin and cold. The smell was very strong. It smelled like wet stone and very old, dusty paper. It was the smell of things that were forgotten for many years. Henry reached the bottom of the stairs. His boots touched a floor made of hard, cold stone. He waited for Rose. When she reached the bottom, she turned on her small flashlight. The beam of light was thin, but it cut through the darkness. The room was not large. It had low ceilings with thick wooden beams. The walls were made of grey stone. All around them, there were wooden shelves. These shelves did not have colorful books like the library above. Instead, they were filled with stacks of old papers, leather folders, and small metal boxes. "This is not just a basement," Rose whispered. Her voice sounded small in the stone room. "This is an archive. A secret archive." They began to walk through the narrow space between the shelves. Henry touched one of the folders. The leather was dry and broke under his fingers. He saw dates on some of the papers. They were from 80, 90, even 100 years ago. These were the secrets of the town. There were records of land, money, and old families. "Look at this," Rose said. She pointed her light at a shelf in the corner. On the shelf, there was a small wooden box. It was covered in a thick layer of white dust. It was the only thing on that shelf. Henry walked to the box. He felt a strange feeling in his chest. This box looked different from the metal ones. It looked personal. He blew the dust away. He used his sleeve to clean the top of the box. There was a small silver plate on the lid. On the plate, there were 2 letters. "TG." Rose gasped. She put her hand over her mouth. "Those are my father's initials," she said. "Thomas Green." Henry looked at the box. It was locked with a small, simple lock. He looked around the floor and found a heavy piece of metal. He was about to break the lock when he heard a sound. It was a muffled sound from above them. It was the sound of someone walking on the floor of the storage room. The stranger was still there. He was standing exactly on top of the trapdoor. Henry and Rose stayed perfectly still. They did not breathe. They heard the sound of the rug being moved. Then, they heard the metal ring of the trapdoor hit the wood. The stranger was opening the door. "We have to go deeper," Henry whispered. He saw a small, dark opening at the back of the stone room. It looked like a narrow tunnel. Rose grabbed the wooden box. "I'm not leaving this behind," she said. They moved toward the dark opening just as a new beam of light appeared at the top of the stairs. The stranger was coming down. Henry and Rose stepped into the tunnel and disappeared into the shadows. The tunnel was very narrow. Henry and Rose walked carefully. The ceiling was low, so they had to bend their heads. The air was thick and hard to breathe. After a few minutes, they reached a small area where the tunnel became wider. There were some old wooden crates against the wall. They stopped there to rest and listen. The sound of the intruder was far away now. Henry could hear his own heart beating. Rose sat on the cold floor and placed the wooden box on her lap. She looked at the silver plate with her father's initials. Her hands were shaking. "Open it," Henry whispered. Rose did not have a key, but the lock was very old. Henry found a sharp piece of stone on the ground. He pushed the stone into the lock and turned it hard. A small sound of metal breaking filled the quiet tunnel. The lid of the box opened slowly. Inside the box, there were no gold coins or expensive jewels. Instead, there was a large stack of letters. They were tied together with a thin blue ribbon. The paper was yellow and very dry. Rose touched the top letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the same handwriting from the book in the shop. It was her father's writing. "They are addressed to my mother," Rose whispered. Her voice was full of emotion. "But she never received them. He wrote them, but he never sent them." She untied the ribbon. She picked up a letter from the middle of the stack. She began to read it quickly. Henry watched her face. He saw her eyes move back and forth. Her expression changed from sadness to surprise. "What does it say?" Henry asked. Rose looked at him. He was scared. "Henry. He says he found a secret about the town's founding families. He says a group called the Silent wanted to destroy the old parts of the town to find something hidden in the earth. And he mentions Mr. Miller. Does he say Mr. Miller was an enemy?" Rose shook her head. "No. It is the opposite. He says, Miller is the only man I can trust. He is helping me hide the truth. If I disappear, Miller will keep the record safe until the right time." Henry felt a wave of guilt. He remembered how he felt about Mr. Miller earlier. He thought the old man was a villain. But Mr. Miller was actually a protector. He was guarding the letters and the book for 20 years. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed through the tunnel. It was the sound of a heavy metal object hitting the stone floor back in the basement. Then, they heard a voice. It was deep and angry. "I know you are in here." The voice shouted, "Give me the box, and you can leave." It was the man in the grey coat. He was inside the tunnel now. He was searching for them. Henry stood up and helped Rose. "We have to go," Henry said. "We cannot let him take these letters." They grabbed the box and the letters. They began to run deeper into the dark tunnel. They did not know where the tunnel led, but they knew they could not go back. Behind them, they heard the heavy sound of boots hitting the ground. The chase was beginning. The tunnel was long and turned many times. Henry and Rose ran until their legs felt heavy and their breath was short. The light from the man in the grey coat was far behind them now, but they could still hear the distant, rhythmic sound of his boots hitting the stone. The tunnel was becoming smaller and colder. Suddenly, the tunnel ended at a heavy metal door. Henry pushed it, but it did not move. He pushed again with all his strength. The door opened with a slow, grinding sound of metal on metal. They stepped through and found themselves in a small, square room made of grey bricks. In the center of the room, a single candle burned on a small wooden crate. Sitting on the floor next to the candle was a man. He looked very old and very tired. His clothes were dirty, and there was a small bandage on his arm. It was Mr. Miller. "Mr. Miller!" Henry cried out. He felt a huge sense of relief. The old man looked up. His blue eyes were not cold anymore. They were full of sadness and a little bit of hope. He looked at Rose, then at the wooden box in her hands. He stood up slowly, leaning against the brick wall for support. "I'm glad you found each other," Mr. Miller said. His voice was very weak. "I tried to reach the library before them, but they were too fast. They caught me at the shop, but I escaped through the basement window. We thought you were one of them," Rose said. She held the letters tightly. "We thought you were hiding the truth because you were a part of the Silent." Mr. Miller shook his head slowly. "No, Rose. Your father was my best friend. When he realized the danger, he asked me to keep the book and the letters safe. He knew the Silent, the mayor and his people, wanted to find the gold to gain power over the whole region. I promised him I would wait for the right person to come. I waited for you." Henry looked at the bandage on the old man's arm. "They hurt you." "It is only a small cut," Mr. Miller replied. "But we have no time for stories now. The man in the grey coat is Silas's best hunter. He will not stop until he has that box. He wants the letters because they contain the names of everyone in the silent. It is the only evidence that can stop the mayor." Henry looked around the small room. "Is there a way out?" "The tunnel is a trap." Mr. Miller pointed to a small, dark ladder in the corner that led up to a hole in the ceiling. "That leads to an old storage shed behind the library. It is hidden by trees. You must take the letters and go. I will stay here and slow him down." "No," Henry said firmly. "We are not leaving you behind again. We are a team now." Rose nodded in agreement. She put the letters inside her coat to keep them safe. "Henry is right. We go together, or we don't go at all." A loud sound came from the tunnel. It was the sound of a heavy door being kicked open. The man in the grey coat was very close. Mr. Miller looked at the two young adults and saw their determination. He gave a small, tired smile. "Then move quickly," the old man said. "The ladder is old, but it is strong. I will follow you." Henry began to climb the ladder. The metal was cold and felt slippery. He reached the top and pushed a heavy wooden cover. He felt the cold night air on his face. He was back outside, but the mystery was far from over. Henry pulled himself up through the hole in the floor. He was inside a small, dark storage shed. The air was cold and smelled like old wood and wet grass. He reached down and helped Rose climb up. She still held her father's wooden box. Finally, Mr. Miller climbed the ladder. The old man was breathing hard, and his face was very pale. Henry helped him sit down on an old wooden chair in the corner of the shed. Outside, the wind was blowing hard. Small drops of rain hit the roof of the shed. It made a soft, rhythmic sound. Henry looked through a small, dirty window. He could see the back of the library. A light was moving inside the library basement. The man in the grey coat was still searching. "He will find the ladder soon," Henry whispered. "We cannot stay here." Mr. Miller looked at the letters in Rose's coat. "For 20 years. I lived with a lie," he said. His voice was stronger now, but very sad. "Everyone in town thought I was a cold, lonely man who only cared about his books. I let them think that. It was the only way to keep the secret safe. You were protecting me," Rose said softly. She sat on the floor next to him. "You were protecting my father's memory. Your father was a hero, Rose," Mr. Miller replied. "He found out that the mayor and Silas were using the town's money for their own projects. They wanted to find the old gold to become the most powerful people in the country. Thomas knew he could not stop them alone. He hid the map and the letters, and he told me to watch over everything until you were an adult." Henry looked at the old man. He felt a lot of respect for him. "But why did you give me the job, Mr. Miller?" "Why now?" "Because I am getting old, Henry," Mr. Miller said. "I saw the man in the grey coat watching the shop. I knew my time was short. I needed someone young and honest. Someone like you. When you found the book, I knew the mystery was finally moving toward its end." Suddenly, they heard a loud noise from the library. It was the sound of a heavy door hitting a wall. Then, they saw a flash of light in the trees near the shed. The man in the grey coat was outside. He was walking toward the shed. He held a large flashlight in one hand and a heavy metal tool in the other. "He is here," Henry said. His heart began to beat very fast. "You must go to the clock tower," Mr. Miller whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy iron key. He gave it to Henry. "This key opens a secret door at the base of the tower. The final part of the map is there. Without it, the letters are only half of the story. "We are not leaving you, Mr. Miller," Rose said, her eyes filling with tears. "I will be fine," the old man said with a small smile. "I will hide in the shadows of the park. He wants the box, not me. Go now. Run through the trees." Henry grabbed Rose's hand. They opened the back door of the shed very quietly. They stepped out into the rain and the dark. They ran into the deep shadows of the trees, leaving the protector behind. Henry and Rose ran through the dark park. The rain was cold and wet. They could not see far because of the thick fog. Henry held the iron key tightly in his pocket. Rose held the wooden box under her coat to keep it dry. They wanted to reach the clock tower, but it was on the other side of the town square. "We have to be careful," Henry whispered. "He is looking for us." They reached the edge of the park. Across the street, they could see the dark shape of the bookshop. It looked lonely in the fog. Suddenly, Henry stopped. He pulled Rose behind a large stone statue of a lion. "Look," Henry said. A man was standing in front of the bookshop. It was the man in the grey coat. He stood under a yellow street lamp. The light made his shadow look very long and thin on the wet ground. He was not moving. He was looking at the front window of the shop. Then, he walked to the door and tried to open it. When the door did not move, he hit the wood with his heavy hand. A dull, heavy sound echoed in the empty street. Henry and Rose stayed very still. They did not want him to see them. The man in the grey coat turned his head. He looked at the park. For a moment, Henry thought the man saw them. Henry felt a cold fear in his chest. He held his breath and did not move a muscle. The man in the grey coat began to walk. He did not go into the shop. He began to walk toward the center of the town. His steps were slow and heavy. He looked at every dark corner and every parked car. He was searching for them like a hunter. "He is going toward the town square," Rose whispered. "That is where the clock tower is. We must find another way," Henry said. "We cannot follow him on the main street. He will see us." They decided to use the narrow alleys behind the buildings. These paths were dirty and full of old boxes, but they were dark. No one could see them there. They walked quickly through the mud. Henry looked at the tall buildings above them. The town felt different tonight. It felt like a giant maze. The rain became stronger. Henry and Rose moved through the narrow alley. The ground was covered in wet paper and old pieces of wood. It was hard to walk fast, but they did not stop. Henry looked back every few seconds. He saw only the grey fog and the dark walls. "Are you okay?" Henry asked. Rose nodded. "I am just cold. But we must continue. My father waited 20 years for this. I cannot stop now." They reached the end of the alley. The clock tower was now directly in front of them. It was a very old building made of dark stone. It was very tall and looked like a giant guarding the town. At the very top, the big clock showed the time. It was 5 minutes before midnight. Henry saw the man in the grey coat again. He was standing near the entrance of the tower, looking at the door. Henry and Rose stayed in the shadows of an old stone wall. The rain was heavy now. The man in the grey coat moved away from the door of the clock tower. He looked around. Suddenly, his eyes stopped on the wall where Henry and Rose were hiding. He did not look surprised. He looked like he expected them to be there. "Come out," the man said. His voice was loud even with the wind and the rain. "I know you have the key. I know you have the letters." Henry looked at Rose. She was very still. He stepped out into the light of the street lamp. Rose followed him. She held the wooden box tightly. "Who are you?" Henry asked. The man walked toward them. He took off his hat. His face was hard and full of old scars. "My name is Silas," he said. His voice was deep and very calm. "For many years, I worked for the families of this town. I did the jobs they did not want to do. Now, I want what is mine. The gold does not belong to you," Rose said. Her voice was strong. "It belongs to the town. My father died because of your greed." Silas laughed. It was a dry, cold sound. "Your father was a fool, Rose. He thought he could save the world with a book and a map. But the world does not want to be saved. It wants to be owned. And with the gold under this tower, I will own everything." He held out his hand. His silver ring shone in the yellow light. "Give me the box. Give me the key. If you do, you can walk away. If you don't, the fog will hide what happens next." Henry felt the iron key in his pocket. He looked at the heavy door of the clock tower. It was only 10 meters away. But Silas was in the way. Silas moved closer. He was a big man, and he looked very strong. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy metal object. It was a long, sharp tool. "The map is in my head," Henry lied. "If you hurt us, you will never find the final room. The tower is a maze of gears and old wood. You need us." Silas stopped. He looked into Henry's eyes. He was trying to see if Henry was telling the truth. "You are a brave man, Henry. But bravery is often just another word for stupidity." Suddenly, the clock at the top of the tower made a deep, loud sound. It was midnight. The sound of the bell moved through the air like a heavy wave. Silas looked up at the clock for 1 second. "Now," Henry whispered. He grabbed Rose's arm and they ran. They did not run away from the tower. They ran towards Silas. Silas was surprised. He tried to grab Henry, but Henry pushed him hard. Silas fell back against a wooden post. Henry and Rose reached the tower door. Henry pulled the iron key from his pocket. He pushed it into the lock and turned it. The lock was old and difficult, but it opened with a heavy sound of metal. They pushed the door and ran inside the dark tower. "Stop!" Silas shouted. He was back on his feet. Henry pulled the door shut just as Silas reached it. He heard the heavy sound of Silas hitting the door with his shoulder, but the wood was thick and strong. Henry looked for a way to lock the door from the inside. He saw a large iron bar. He pushed it into place. They were safe for a moment, but they were trapped inside the tower with no light. Inside the base of the clock tower, the air was thick with the smell of old oil and cold dust. It was very dark, but Rose turned on her small flashlight. The light showed huge wooden beams and heavy iron chains that moved slowly. Above them, the giant gears of the clock made a slow, rhythmic grinding sound. The whole building felt like a living machine. Henry stood by the front door. He listened. The heavy hitting sound from Silas stopped. For a moment, it was very quiet. Henry did not feel safe. He knew Silas was not a man who gave up easily. He stopped. Rose whispered. She was shivering. Her green coat was wet from the rain. "He is looking for another way in," Henry replied. Suddenly, they heard a different sound. It was not coming from the front door. It was coming from below their feet. There was a small basement under the tower floor where the heavy weights of the clock hung. They heard the sound of a lock breaking and a heavy wooden door opening. "The basement door," Henry said. He found it. They could not stay on the ground floor. If Silas came up from the basement, they would be trapped against the front door. Henry looked around the room. He saw a pile of old wooden crates in the corner. Above the crates, there was a small, narrow window. It was very high, near the ceiling. "There," Henry pointed. "We have to go through that window." He pushed 2 heavy crates against the wall. He climbed onto the first one. then the second. He reached for the window. The stone was cold and slippery. He pulled himself up and looked out. The window led to a very narrow alleyway between the tower and a tall brick warehouse. "Rose, give me the box," Henry said. Rose handed the wooden box to him. Henry placed it carefully on the stone ledge outside. Then he reached down and grabbed Rose's hands. He was strong, and he pulled her up. She was small, and she climbed through the window quickly. As Rose was halfway through, they heard a heavy boot hit the floor inside the tower. A beam of light appeared from the basement stairs. It was Silas. "I see you," Silas shouted. His voice was full of anger. Henry did not look back. He climbed through the window and dropped down into the mud of the alley. Rose was already on her feet, holding the box. They ran down the narrow path. The alley was dark and full of shadows. They turned a corner and hid behind a large metal trash bin. They stayed very still. They heard Silas reach the window above them. He made a sound of frustration. He was too large to fit through the narrow opening. They heard him jump back down to the floor inside the tower. "He is going to come around to the alley," Henry whispered. "We only have a minute." They were back outside in the rain, but they were safe for now. Henry looked at the tower. He realized that the front door was not the real way to the secret. Mr. Miller gave him a key for a secret door at the base. They needed to find that specific door while Silas was busy inside the main room. Henry and Rose were breathing hard. The cold rain was soaking their clothes. They were hiding behind a large metal bin in the dark alley. Silas was somewhere nearby. They could hear his heavy boots on the street. He was angry. Henry knew they did not have much time. Silas was a smart man, and he would find the alley soon. "Rose, give me the map," Henry whispered. Rose reached into her wet coat. She pulled out the folded paper. It was a little bit damp at the edges, but the ink was still clear. Henry turned on his small flashlight. He held it low so the light would not reflect off the walls. He looked at the drawing of the clock tower very carefully. He noticed something new. There was a very small red mark on the drawing that he did not see before. It was not at the front door where Silas was. It was on the side of the tower, near the ground. Next to the mark, there were two small words written in red ink. "The North Face." "Look at this," Henry said, pointing to the paper. "The door Silas is guarding is the main door. That is on the south side. The map shows a mark on the north side. That must be where the secret door is." Henry realized that the red marks on the map were not just for the buildings. They were for the hidden entrances. The X on the bookshop, the X on the library, and now the X on the tower all pointed to secrets that were underground. "We have to move," Rose said. She looked toward the end of the alley. "I see a light." They stood up carefully. They stayed close to the stone wall of the tower. They moved slowly toward the north side of the building. The ground was muddy and slippery. They reached the north wall. It was very dark here. The wall was covered in old, dry ivy and pieces of broken wood. Henry began to move the ivy with his hands. The plants were thick and cold. After a minute, his fingers touched something hard. It was not stone. It was cold metal. He pulled back the ivy and saw a small iron door. It was very small and painted black. It was hidden perfectly by the shadows of the tall warehouse next to it. "Is this it?" Rose asked. Henry looked at the iron key Mr. Miller gave him. He pushed the key into the small hole in the door. The key turned easily. The lock made a soft, metallic sound as it opened. He pulled the door, and it moved without any noise. Inside, there was a narrow stone staircase that went down into the earth. Suddenly, a flashlight beam hit the wall above their heads. "Stop right there," Silas shouted. He was at the entrance of the alley. He began to run toward them. Henry and Rose did not wait. They stepped through the small door. Henry pulled the door shut and turned the key from the inside. He heard the heavy sound of Silas hitting the metal door. But the iron was strong. They were safe for now. Henry felt the cold stone walls with his hands. "We are under the tower now, Rose. This is the real path." Rose turned on her light. The stairs were very old and covered in dust. They began to walk down, leaving Silas and the rain behind them. The stone stairs were very narrow and steep. Henry moved his flashlight slowly so Rose could see where to step. The air was much colder here than it was in the library basement. It smelled like wet iron and very old mud. Every time they took a step, their boots made a soft, hollow sound on the stone. They were now deep under the center of the town. "I can feel the ground shaking," Rose whispered. She held her father's wooden box under one arm. She used her other hand to touch the damp wall for balance. Henry stopped for a second. He listened. Rose was right. There was a low, heavy vibration in the air. It felt like a giant heart was beating somewhere inside the tower. "It is the clock mechanism," Henry explained. "The weights are very heavy. They move slowly, and the vibration travels through the stone." They reached the bottom of the stairs. They were in a circular room made of huge, grey rocks. In the middle of the room, for very thick iron chains went from the ceiling down into a deep, dark hole in the floor. The chains were moving almost invisibly. This was the heart of the tower. Henry walked around the edge of the room. He looked at the walls. He remembered the map. The map showed that this room was not just for the clock. It was a crossroads. There were 3 other small wooden doors in the walls. Each door had a sign above it, but the paint was so old that the words were gone. "The map said there is something here," Henry said. He pointed his light at the rocks. "Something more than just chains." Rose walked to the wall on the east side of the room. She moved her hand over the stones. "My father's journal mentioned a hidden weight. He said the gold was not a pile of coins on the floor. He said the gold was part of the tower itself." Henry helped her search the wall. They pushed on the stones, one by one. After many minutes, Henry found a stone that felt loose. It was near the floor. He pulled it with his fingers. The stone moved out easily. Behind it, there was a small, dark space. He reached inside and pulled out an old, dusty leather bag. It was very heavy. He opened the bag. Inside, there was not gold, but a collection of very old tools made of brass and silver. There was also a small, folded piece of paper. Henry opened the paper. It was a letter, but it was not from Rose's father. It was much older. The date at the top was from 100 years ago. "It is a message from the person who built the tower," Henry said. He read the words slowly. "It says that the tower is a lock. The clock is the key. To find the treasure, the clock must stop at the wrong time." Suddenly, they heard a sound from above. It was the sound of a heavy metal door being forced open. It was a loud, grinding noise that echoed down the stairs. Silas was not at the front door anymore. He had found the secret entrance on the north face. "He is coming down," Rose said. Her eyes were wide with fear. Henry looked at the 3 wooden doors. They had to choose a path, and they had to do it now. The sound of Silas's boots on the stone stairs was getting louder. Each step was a heavy action that signaled the end of their head start. Henry and Rose stood in the center of the circular room, surrounded by the 3 mysterious wooden doors. The vibration of the moving clock chains felt like a countdown. "Which one?" Rose asked, her voice trembling slightly. She gripped her father's wooden box so hard her knuckles were white. Henry quickly looked at the 3 doors. The left door. It was covered in a thick layer of green mold. The air coming from the bottom smelled of damp earth. The middle door. This one was reinforced with iron bands. It looked the strongest and the most important. The right door. The wood was dry and cracked. It was slightly smaller than the others. Henry grabbed the old brass tools they had just found. He looked at the letter from the builder again. The clock is the key. To find the treasure, the clock must stop at the wrong time. The middle door is too obvious, Henry whispered. Silas would go straight for the strongest door. The moldy door leads to the saws or the river. We need the one that connects to the mechanism. He noticed a small engraving on the handle of the right door. It was a tiny image of a sun setting. He looked up at the giant chains. One of the weights was slowly descending toward the floor. In here, Henry said, pulling the right door open. It moved on its hinges but gave way. They stepped inside and quickly pulled the door shut just as a beam of light hit the circular room behind them. They heard Silas's voice, echoing and distorted by the stone walls. I can smell the fear, children. There is nowhere else to run. They were now in a narrow space filled with vertical wooden pillars. Between the pillars, the massive weights of the clock hung like giant metal ghosts. These were the weights that powered the clock for the entire town. Henry realized that if they could jam the mechanism here, the clock would stop. The letter said to stop it at the wrong time, Henry said, looking at his watch. It was 12:15 a.m. If the clock stops now, it will be the wrong time because it's not a round hour or a scheduled maintenance. How do we stop something this big? Rose asked, looking at the heavy chains. Henry looked at the silver and brass tools. One of them was a long, hooked rod. He saw a large gear spinning slowly near the ceiling. If he could wedge the rod into the teeth of that gear, the whole system would lock. I need to reach that gear, Henry said. He began to climb a wooden ladder built into the side of a support beam. Suddenly, the door behind them began to shake. Silas was throwing his shoulder against it. The wood began to splinter. Henry, hurry! Rose cried out. She picked up a heavy piece of discarded iron from the floor, ready to defend the entrance. Henry reached the top of the ladder. The giant gear was right in front of him. It was covered in thick, black grease. He took the silver rod and aimed for the gap between the spinning teeth. He knew that if he missed, the force of the machine could break his arm or worse. Henry braced his feet against the wooden ladder. He could feel the vibration of the entire tower through the soles of his boots. The gear was massive, a serrated circle of iron that moved with a slow, unstoppable force. Below him, the door splintered. A heavy boot crashed through the wood, followed by another. Silas was breaking through. Henry! Rose's voice was sharp with panic. She was standing by the door, the heavy iron scrap raised in her hands. Almost there. Henry gritted his teeth. He thrust the silver rod into the teeth of the rotating gear. There was a sound like a sharp metal impact. The gear slowed, but it didn't stop. It began to grind against the rod, throwing off bright, hot sparks that lit up the dark chamber like tiny stars. The smell of burning grease and hot iron filled the air. Henry pushed with all his weight, his muscles screaming. Suddenly, the grinding sound turned into a deep, metallic groan. The giant weight hanging from the chain jerked upward, then stayed still. The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in perhaps 100 years, the town clock had stopped. At that exact moment, the door to the chamber exploded inward. Silas stepped into the room, his face red with exertion and rage. He looked at Rose, then up at Henry on the ladder. "You've broken it," Silas growled, his voice a low hiss. "You've ruined the mechanism. But it won't save you." He stepped toward the ladder, but before he could reach it, the floor began to hum. It wasn't the rhythmic vibration of the clock anymore. It was a smooth, mechanical whirring. In the center of the room, a large circular section of the stone floor began to sink. It didn't drop. It spiraled downward like a screw. As it moved, it revealed a hidden compartment lined with velvet that had long ago turned to dust. Inside the compartment sat a heavy iron chest, its lid decorated with the same sunset symbol found on the door. Silas froze. His eyes widened, and a look of pure, hungry greed took over his face. He forgot about Henry and Rose. He forgot about his anger. He walked toward the opening floor. Finally, he whispered, "The legacy of the founders." "Don't touch it, Silas." Rose shouted. "It doesn't belong to you." Silas ignored her. He reached down into the opening to grab the handle of the chest. But as his hand touched the iron, the stopped gear above Henry suddenly shifted. The silver rod, bent and stressed, snapped in two. With the obstruction gone, the massive weights of the clock were no longer held back. They dropped with a violent force. The chains whipped through the air like snakes. The sudden movement triggered a secondary safety mechanism in the floor. "Get back!" Henry yelled, jumping down from the ladder. The spiraling floor section didn't just stop. It reversed. It began to rise rapidly, intending to seal the compartment once more. Silas, his arm still reaching for the chest, realized too late that the trap was closing. He lurched backward, barely pulling his hand away as the stone slab slammed back into place. The room fell silent again, but the atmosphere had changed. The chest was gone, sealed back into the earth. Silas stood over the cold stone, his chest heaving. He looked at Henry and Rose, his eyes dark with a desperate, wild light. "You've locked it," Silas breathed. "You've locked it away again." He raised his heavy metal tool, his knuckles white. He was no longer a hunter. He was a cornered animal. Silas didn't wait. He lunged across the stone floor, the heavy metal tool whistling through the air. Henry pushed Rose behind a thick wooden support beam just as the tool slammed into the wood, sending a spray of splinters flying. Silas was fast for a man of his size, his movements fueled by the realization that his life's ambition was locked behind a slab of stone. "You think you're clever, boy?" Silas spat, wrenching his tool free from the beam. "You've just turned this tower into your tomb." Henry scrambled backward, his eyes searching the room. The clock was silent, but the tension in the air was electric. He looked at the floor where the chest had vanished. The sunset symbol was still there, carved into the stone. He remembered the builder's note. "The clock is the key." He realized that the mechanism hadn't just closed because the gear moved. It closed because the clock was no longer at the wrong time. It was dead. "Rose! The box!" Henry shouted. "Check the bottom of the box." As Silas pivoted to strike again, Rose fumbled with her father's wooden box. She turned it over, her fingers tracing the base. "There's a notch." "Henry, there's a small sliding panel." Silas roared and charged at Rose. Henry didn't think. He grabbed a length of the heavy iron chain hanging from the ceiling and swung his entire body weight into it. The chain, connected to a massive lead weight, swung like a giant pendulum. It caught Silas in the shoulder, throwing him off balance and sending him crashing into a pile of old crates. Rose slid the panel open. Inside was a small brass dial, identical to the gears of the clock above. "It's a miniature gear, Henry. It has numbers on it. Set it to the time the clock stopped." Henry yelled, dodging a piece of wood Silas threw at him. 12:15. Rose quickly turned the tiny brass dial. 12:15. As the numbers clicked into place, a low hum vibrated through the floor once more. The stone slab didn't open this time. Instead, the wall behind the main weights began to shift. A narrow door, previously invisible against the grey rock, swung inward. Silas saw the door and scrambled to his feet, but he was limping now. The impact of the chain had dazed him. He looked from the hidden door to the letters in Rose's coat. He knew the letters were the evidence that would hang him and the mayor, but the door led to the foundations. The letters, Silas. Henry stood between the man and Rose, holding the broken half of the silver rod like a short sword. They're already as good as published. Mr. Miller isn't alone. He's with the sheriff by now." Silas's face twisted. The calm, cold hunter was gone, replaced by a man who saw his world collapsing. He looked at the hidden door, then at the stairs leading up to the bell. He realized he couldn't take the letters and he couldn't get the chest. He did the only thing a cornered animal does. He ran for the exit. But he didn't run for the stairs. He ran for the hidden door, thinking it was a way out. "Wait!" Henry called out, seeing the way the weights were hanging. "Silas, don't!" The hidden door wasn't an exit. It was the counterweight room. As Silas stepped through the threshold, his weight triggered the final safety release. The massive weights, no longer held by the jammed gears, plummeted the final 3 feet to the floor. The floor of the small room tilted like a seesaw. With a cry of shock, Silas slid backward into a dark, narrow shaft, a ventilation flue that led straight down to the town's old flooded tunnels. The sound of his slide echoed for a long time, followed by a distant splash. Silence returned to the tower. Henry and Rose stood still, listening. The only sound was the wind howling outside and the heavy impact of the front door finally being broken open from the outside. "Police! Stay where you are!" A voice boomed from the ground floor. Henry leaned against a beam, his heart finally slowing down. He looked at Rose. She was holding the letters to her chest, her face wet with rain and tears. "We did it," she whispered. "No," Henry said, looking at the stopped clock. "Your father did it. We just finished the story." 3 weeks had passed since the night the clock stopped. The thick fog that had choked the town for days finally lifted, replaced by a crisp, clear winter sun. The town square was no longer a place of shadows and secrets. It was bustling with people, though the air of gossip was thicker than ever. The mayor had resigned following a swift investigation by the regional authorities. The letters Rose found had acted like a master key, unlocking decades of financial lies and proving that the Silent were little more than a group of greedy men hiding behind the town's history. Silas was found alive in the lower tunnels, wet, bruised, and facing a very long sentence in a cold cell. Henry stood on a ladder in Miller's books, carefully placing a rare edition of poetry on the top shelf. The shop smelled different now. The scent of old paper and floor wax remained, but the heavy air of mystery had been replaced by a sense of peace. The door chimes sang their musical note. Henry looked down and smiled. Rose walked in, her dark green coat open and a bright scarf around her neck. She looked lighter, her eyes no longer carrying the weight of 20 years of searching. "Good morning, Henry," she said, leaning against the desk. "Mr. Miller said you'd be up there all day if I didn't come to stop you." "There's a lot of organizing to do," Henry replied, climbing down. "Mr. Miller wants the history section completely catalogued by the end of the month." Mr. Miller emerged from the back room, carrying a tray with 3 mugs of hot tea. He moved slowly, and he still used a cane, but his blue eyes were bright. He looked at Henry and Rose with something that looked suspiciously like a fatherly smile. "The history section is in good hands," Mr. Miller said, setting the tea on the desk. "The town council wants to turn the hidden chamber in the tower into a museum. They've asked me to be the curator." "And the gold?" Henry asked. "It wasn't gold bars," Mr. Miller explained. "It was a trust. A massive collection of land deeds and old bonds intended to keep the town schools and libraries funded forever. The founders didn't want it found until the town truly needed it. I think that time is now." Rose reached into her bag and pulled out a small, framed photograph. It was her father, Thomas, sitting at the very desk where they now stood. He was young, smiling, and holding a thick book. "I'm leaving this here," she said, placing it on a small shelf near the window. "This is where he belonged." Henry looked around the shop. He had come here looking for silence and a quiet life. He had found much more than that. He had found a purpose, a home, and a pair of friends he never expected to have. "So," Rose said, picking up her tea, What's the next project, Mr. Miller? Any more secret maps hidden in the walls? Mr. Miller chuckled, a dry but warm sound. For now, Rose, I think we've had enough excitement. But then again, this is a bookshop. Every book is a secret waiting for the right person to open it. Henry picked up a duster and turned back to the shelves. The town clock chimed in the distance, perfectly on time. He was no longer just an assistant. He was the guardian of the stories. And for the first time in his life, Henry was exactly where he wanted to be. The piece that followed the arrest of Silas and the resignation of the mayor was, as Mr. Miller often remarked, a fragile thing bound in thin paper. For a month, Henry had enjoyed the simple rhythm of the bookshop. He spent his mornings dusting the high shelves and his afternoons helping Rose sort through her father's recovered notes. The town was healing, and the clock tower had become a symbol of transparency rather than a vault of shadows. However, on a Tuesday morning in late February, the bell above the door rang with a sharp, insistent clarity. It wasn't the soft chime of a local looking for a novel. A man stepped inside, framed by the cold morning light. He was dressed in a charcoal grey suit that looked far too expensive for their small town. He carried a leather briefcase embossed with a gold seal Henry didn't recognize, a stylized eye looking through a magnifying glass. The man's hair was perfectly silver, and his spectacles sat on the bridge of a very sharp nose. "Can I help you?" Henry asked, stepping out from the history section. The man didn't look at the books. He looked at the room as if he were evaluating the price of the floorboards. "My name is Dr. Aries Thorne," he said. His voice was like a cello, deep, smooth, and practiced. "I am a senior archivist from the National Historical Preservation Society. I believe you've recently uncovered a significant amount of municipal assets." Mr. Miller appeared from the back, leaning on his new mahogany cane. "Assets? That's a cold word for a town's history, Doctor. We call them the Founders' Trust." Dr. Thorne turned, offering a thin, polite smile. "Mr. Miller, I presume your efforts in protecting the archive are commendable, if a bit unorthodox. However, the discovery of the bonds and the mechanism in the tower has triggered a federal audit. Such a find doesn't just belong to a town, it belongs to the nation's heritage." Henry felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He looked at Rose, who had just walked in from the kitchen with a stack of files. She stopped, her eyes narrowing at the stranger. "The trust is for the town," Rose said firmly. "The deeds specifically say it's for the local schools and libraries. It's not for a museum in the capital." Dr. Thorne walked toward the desk, his eyes finally landing on the small wooden box Rose's father had owned. "Ah, the green box. Fascinating." He didn't ask for permission. He simply leaned in to examine the sunset symbol on the lid. "Tell me, did you find the second seal? Or did you think the clock tower was the only lock in this town?" The room went silent. Henry and Mr. Miller exchanged a glance. They had assumed the mystery was solved. The second seal was a term they had never heard. "There is no second seal," Henry said, though he felt a sudden doubt. Thorne straightened his suit and looked at them with a touch of pity. "The Silent weren't just a group of greedy locals, Mr. Henry. They were a branch of something much older. The clock tower powers the town, but the second seal, that powers the truth. And if you haven't found it, then the real danger hasn't even begun to knock." He placed a business card on the desk. It wasn't paper. It was thin, cold metal. "I'll be at the local inn for the week. I suggest you look at your father's notes again, Miss Green. Look for the mention of the submerged library." Without another word, Thorne turned and walked out. The bell chimed once, sounding like a warning. Henry looked at the card. The metal was etched with a single word: Alethea. The metal business card sat on the wooden desk, reflecting the dim light of the shop like a cold, unblinking eye. Henry, Rose, and Mr. Miller stood in a tight circle around it. the silence of the bookstore suddenly feeling heavy and crowded. The name Dr. Aries Thorne seemed to vibrate with an authority that none of them liked. The submerged library. Rose whispered, her voice barely audible. She pulled her father's leather-bound journal toward her, her fingers flying through the yellowed pages. "I've read this book 1,000 times, Henry. I know every ink blot and coffee stain. I've never seen those words. Maybe it's not written in plain English," Henry suggested. He grabbed a magnifying glass from the desk drawer. "Your father was an expert at hiding things in plain sight. He used the architecture of the town as a code. Why wouldn't he do the same with his writing?" Mr. Miller sighed, leaning heavily on his cane. Thomas was a man of layers. He knew that if the first layer, the clock tower, was ever compromised, the seeker would need a deeper truth. But the submerged library, that sounds like a myth from the old canal workers. They spent the next 4 hours huddled in the back room, surrounded by half-consumed mugs of tea and stacks of topographical maps. Henry focused on the town's water system. If something was submerged, it had to be near the Blackwood River or the old irrigation tunnels that ran beneath the northern orchards. "Wait," Rose said, her finger stopping on a sketch of the town's original foundation plan from 1892. "Look at the river bend near the old tannery. My father drew a small symbol here, a series of wavy lines topped by a book." Henry leaned in. The sketch was tiny, almost hidden in the shading of the riverbank. "That's not just a river. Look at the depth markers." He's noted a structural hollow beneath the water level. The discovery. Location. The east bank, beneath the ruins of the 19th century tannery. Condition. Likely flooded or sealed by the 1924 flood. Significance. Mentioned in Thorne's warning as the location of the second seal. The water table in that area is incredibly high, Henry noted, his mind racing through the physics of old masonry. If there's a room down there, it wouldn't just be damp, it would be a tomb. The pressure of the river alone would collapse standard brickwork. Unless it wasn't standard brickwork, Mr. Miller added, his eyes sharpening. The founders were obsessed with pneumatic engineering. They used the pressure of the water to power the clock tower's secondary cooling system. If they built a library down there, they would have used airlock chambers. Rose looked at the map, then at the metal card. Thorne knows where it is. He's waiting for us to find the seal because he doesn't have the key. He's an archivist, but he's also a scavenger. He wants us to do the dirty work. Then we don't give him the satisfaction, Henry said, standing up and grabbing his heavy coat. But we can't let that library stay hidden if it contains the names Thorne is looking for. If the Silent were just one branch of a larger tree, we need to know who owns the roots. As they prepared to head toward the river, the shop felt colder. Henry noticed a shadow pass by the front window, a tall, thin figure in a charcoal suit. Thorne wasn't just waiting at the inn. He was watching. The game had shifted from a local hunt to a high-stakes chess match, and the board was hidden beneath the dark, rushing waters of the Blackwood. The walk to the old tannery took them through the dead zone of the industrial district, a place where the town's progress had simply stopped and rotted. The air here didn't smell like old books. It smelled of iron, salt, and the stagnant breath of the Blackwood River. The ruins of the tannery stood like a skeletal ribcage against the grey sky, its brick walls crumbling into the dark water below. "Stay close," Henry warned, his flashlight cutting through the thick mist that clung to the riverbank. "The ground here is unstable. The river has been eating away at the foundations for a century." Rose stepped carefully over a rusted iron pipe. "My father's notes mentioned that the submerged library was built using a unique architectural principle. It wasn't built under the river as much as it was built into the pressure." Henry stopped by a massive stone pillar that had once supported the main vat room. He looked at the water level. The Blackwood was high, its surface churning with cold energy. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and scribbled a formula. To understand how a room could survive down there, he had to calculate the hydrostatic pressure. If the library is 10 meters down, Henry muttered, the walls are holding back nearly double the normal atmospheric pressure. They wouldn't just use stone. They would need a counterweight system, similar to the clock tower. Look! Rose called out. She was kneeling near the base of the central pillar, clearing away a thick layer of moss and river silt. Beneath the grime was a heavy bronze plate, green with oxidation. It bore the same sunset symbol, but this time, the sun was depicted beneath the waves. In the center of the plate was a circular indentation, exactly the size of the brass dial Rose had found in her father's wooden box. The second seal, Mr. Miller whispered, joining them. He looked over his shoulder toward the dark woods they had just emerged from. I can feel Thorn's eyes on us. He's letting us open the door because he doesn't want to get his expensive shoes wet. Henry took the brass dial from Rose. His hands were cold, but his grip was steady. If we open this, the air pressure inside might change rapidly. It's a pneumatic lock. He pressed the dial into the indentation. It fit. He began to turn it, listening for the sound of ancient tumblers moving behind the bronze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a deep, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the soles of their boots. The river water near the pillar began to bubble and churn, as if something large was breathing beneath the surface. Slowly, the bronze plate began to retract, revealing a vertical shaft lined with reinforced glass and iron. It wasn't a ladder. It was a cylinder. It's a diving bell, Henry realized. A permanent one. Just as they prepared to step toward the shaft, a branch snapped in the darkness behind them. The beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the mist, illuminating Dr. Aries Thorn. He wasn't alone. 2 men in dark tactical gear stood behind him, looking much more dangerous than librarians. Excellent work, Mr. Henry, Thorn said, his voice smooth and cold. The hydrostatic calculations were a nice touch. Now, move aside. The society has been waiting a long time to see what's in the basement. The air in the tannery ruins grew thick with the smell of ozone and wet decay. Dr. Aries Thorn stood perfectly still, his expensive wool coat a sharp contrast to the jagged, rusted iron surrounding him. His men moved with military precision, their flashlights creating a crisscross of blinding white light that boxed Henry, Rose, and Mr. Miller against the churning river. I don't think you understand the situation, Doctor, Henry said, his voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He stood between Rose and the tactical team, his hand still resting on the bronze dial. This isn't a museum exhibit. It's a pressurized system. If your men rush us and damage the seal, this entire platform becomes a vacuum. We'll all be pulled into the riverbed before you can say archaeology. Thorn tilted his head, a glimmer of genuine curiosity in his eyes. You have a remarkably firm grasp on Victorian pneumatic safety, Mr. Henry. It's a shame your talents are wasted in a dusty bookshop, but I am not a man who fears a bit of pressure. He's not alone, Henry, Rose whispered, her eyes darting to the tactical gear. The logo on their sleeves. It's not just the National Society. It's a private security firm. Thorn isn't here on official business. Alethea, Mr. Miller spat the name like it was poison. The seekers of unfiltered truth. You're nothing but grave robbers with better vocabulary, Thorn. Thorn ignored the insult, stepping closer. The submerged library contains records that the silent thought were too dangerous for the surface. Names. Bloodlines. The true origins of the wealth that built this entire valley. If you think I'm going to let a librarian and a girl with a dead man's notebook stand in the way of that, you are sadly mistaken. Henry looked down at the cylinder. The glass was thick, reinforced with a leaded lattice that had somehow survived a century of immersion. He realized that the diving bell worked on a simple displacement principle. The airlock protocol. To enter the submerged library, the chamber must undergo a three-stage cycle. Equilibration. Internal air pressure must match the depth relative pressure of the destination. Descent. The cylinder moves through the vertical shaft via a counterweight pulley. Sealing. The upper hatch must be airtight before the lower iris opens. Rose, get in, Henry commanded, his voice dropping to a low, urgent tone. What? Not without you. Get in. Miller, go. Henry didn't wait for them to argue. He grabbed the heavy iron lever next to the dial. Thorn, if your men take one more step, I pull the emergency purge. The shaft will flood, and your second seal will be lost forever. Nobody sees the library. Thorn raised a hand, signaling his men to halt. For a long second, the only sound was the roar of the Blackwood River and the hiss of air escaping the cylinder's valves. Thorn smiled, a thin, dangerous line. A stalemate? How traditional. But you have to go down eventually, Henry, and when you do, there's only one way back up. Henry shoved Rose and Mr. Miller into the cramped, brass-lined interior of the diving bell. He stepped in last, his eyes locked on Thorn. As he pulled the interior handle, the heavy glass door slid shut. The last thing Henry saw before the world turned into a rush of bubbles and dark water was Thorn standing on the edge of the shaft, checking his watch as if he were waiting for a train. Then, gravity took them. The cylinder dropped with a sickening lurch, plunging them deep into the cold, silent heart of the river. The descent was a violent symphony of groaning metal and rushing water. Inside the brass-lined cylinder, Henry, Rose, and Mr. Miller were pressed together in the cramped space. The only light came from the faint green glow of a pressure gauge on the wall. Henry watched the needle climb steadily as they dropped deeper into the riverbed. Finally, with a heavy, muffled thud, the diving bell stopped. For a moment, they sat in absolute silence. Then, a series of mechanical clicks echoed from beneath their feet. The floor of the cylinder didn't open. Instead, the entire glass wall hissed and slid upward into the ceiling. They stepped out into a room that defied everything Henry knew about architecture. It was a vast, circular chamber built entirely of reinforced glass and thick, dark iron. Outside the glass, the Blackwood River moved in slow, heavy swirls of deep blue and murky green. Small river fish darted past, their silver scales reflecting the interior light. "It's beautiful," Rose whispered, her voice echoing in the pressurized air. "It's impossible," Henry corrected, though he was mesmerized. The room was filled with thousands of metal cylinders, each shelved in honeycombed racks that reached from the floor to the high, domed ceiling. These weren't paper books. They were scrolls of vellum and sheets of etched zinc, preserved in a vacuum. In the center of the room stood a massive pedestal. It wasn't made of stone or wood, but of a strange, translucent material that glowed with a soft, internal amber light. On top of the pedestal lay a single, heavy object, a circular plate of gold and lead, divided into 4 quadrants. "The second seal," Mr. Miller said, his eyes wide. He walked toward the pedestal, his cane clicking on the metal floor. Thomas talked about this in his sleep during the final weeks. He called it the Codex of the Silent. "It's not just names, Henry. It's the map of the other towns." Henry joined him at the pedestal. He noticed that the seal was actually a complex mechanism. Each quadrant had a series of sliding pins and rotating rings. The second seal mechanism. The seal operates as a multivariable combination lock. To unlock the central compartment, the quadrants must be aligned according to the 4 pillars of the founders. Commerce, represented by a scale. Industry, represented by a gear. Knowledge, represented by an eye. Silence, represented by a closed mouth. "Look at the glass," Rose said, pointing to the river outside. "The water is turning dark. Something is blocking the light from the surface." Henry looked up. High above them, at the top of the vertical shaft, several dark shapes were descending. They weren't using the diving bell. They were using high-pressure diving suits. Thorn hadn't waited for them to come up. He was sending his team down to take the library by force. "We have to open the seal now," Henry said, his fingers hovering over the sliding pins. "If Thorn gets his hands on this, he won't just control the town's history. He'll have the keys to the entire valley's infrastructure." "Henry, look at the base of the pedestal," Rose warned. "There's a counter. It's triggered by the airlock. We only have 6 minutes before the system initiates a deep purge to protect the archives." The pressure in the room began to change. Henry felt a sharp pop in his ears. He looked at the brass dial in his hand, then at the complex symbols on the seal. He had to solve a century-old puzzle while the weight of the river, and the threat of Thorn's men, closed in around them. The Deep Purge was not just a name, it was a mechanical reality. A low-frequency hum began to resonate through the iron floor, making the glass walls of the submerged library tremble. Outside, the dark figures in high-pressure suits were growing larger. They were descending rapidly, their powerful underwater lamps cutting through the murky Blackwood like searchlights in a storm. 5 minutes, Rose said, her voice tight. She was holding her father's journal open, her eyes darting between the sketches and the pedestal. "Henry, the fourth quadrant. The mouth. It's not a symbol of silence. It's a vent." Henry adjusted the first 2 quadrants. Commerce and industry clicked into place with a heavy, oily sound. The amber light inside the pedestal grew brighter. "If the mouth is a vent, then the silent weren't keeping secrets," Henry muttered, his fingers flying over the knowledge quadrant. "They were keeping a vacuum. The archives aren't just preserved, they're pressurized. If I open this incorrectly, the pressure differential will shatter the glass walls." He looked at the knowledge quadrant. Instead of a simple rotation, the eye had to be depressed in a specific sequence, like a pupil reacting to light. He recalled the light patterns from the clock tower's lens. The pupil sequence, based on the refractive index of the river water and the focal length of the library's dome. Contraction. 3 clicks clockwise. Dilation. 1 click counterclockwise. Focus. 2 clicks inward. The eye clicked. A thin line of light shot up from the pedestal, illuminating a hidden set of engravings on the domed ceiling. It was a list of names, but not the ones they expected. These weren't the founders. These were the victims, the families whose land had been taken to build the valley's dams and reservoirs. "Thorn doesn't want the gold," Mr. Miller realized, watching the ceiling. "He wants the land titles. If he can prove these names still have a claim, the National Society can seize the entire valley under heritage reclamation. He's not an archivist, he's a land grabber on a grand scale." Suddenly, a muffled thud shook the room. One of Thorn's divers had reached the exterior of the dome. He wasn't looking for a door. He was attaching a small, high-explosive charge to the glass. "They're going to breach." Rose cried out. "They can't," Henry said, his face pale. "If they breach, the deep purge will trigger immediately. The library will sink another 50 meters into the silt, and the airlock will be crushed." He turned to the final quadrant. The mouth. Unlike the others, it had no pins. It was a hollow opening. Henry looked at the brass dial Rose had found. It wasn't just a key. It was a plug. He shoved the dial into the mouth and blew into a small hole at the end of the brass handle. The sound of his breath was amplified by the pedestal. It wasn't a whisper. It was a whistle. The frequency matched the humming of the floor. The mouth opened, and instead of a treasure chest, a small, silver cylinder rose from the center of the pedestal. "The second seal is open," Henry whispered. At that exact moment, the explosive charge on the glass ignited. The reinforced pane didn't shatter. It spiderwebbed. A thin, violent jet of freezing river water hissed into the room, cutting through the air like a laser. The deep purge had begun. The floor beneath them started to drop away. The diving bell! Henry shouted, grabbing the silver cylinder. We have to get back to the bell before the room loses buoyancy. They scrambled toward the brass cylinder, the sound of the rushing water growing into a roar as the crack in the glass widened. The library was no longer a sanctuary. It was a sinking ship. The sound of the high-pressure water jet was a terrifying, high-pitched scream that filled the iron chamber. The spiderweb of cracks in the reinforced glass wall was spreading with a sickening speed. Henry, Rose, and Mr. Miller lunged into the small, brass-lined diving bell just as the first few inches of freezing river water began to swirl around their boots. Henry slammed the manual lever. The heavy glass door of the cylinder slid shut and hissed as the pneumatic seals engaged. Outside, the world was a chaotic blur of bubbles and darkness. One of Thorne's divers, caught in the sudden downcurrent of the library's deep purge, was swept past their window, his lights fading into the black silt below. The ballast! Mr. Miller shouted, clutching the support rail. Henry, the room is dragging us down with it. We have to detach. The diving bell was still tethered to the library's central docking ring. As the library began its automated descent into the deeper river trenches to avoid total destruction, it acted like an anchor, pulling the bell down with it. The pressure gauge on the wall began to spin wildly past the safety zone. Henry looked at the control panel. There was a red handle marked with a jagged bolt, the emergency explosive bolt release. If I blow the bolts now, the buoyancy might flip us, Henry said, his voice straining against the roar of the exterior pumps. But if I don't, we're going to be crushed by the time we hit 60 meters. Do it! Rose yelled. We don't have a choice. Henry yanked the handle. A muffled thump vibrated through the floor as the small explosive charges detonated, severing the connection to the sinking library. For a terrifying second, the bell pitched 60 degrees to the left, tossing them against the padded walls. Then, with a sudden, violent lurch, they shot upward. It wasn't a smooth ride. The bell moved like a cork released from the bottom of a pool. Through the window, the murky water turned from black to deep blue, then to a sickly green. Look, Rose pointed out the window. Above them, the lights of the tannery ruins were visible. But there was a problem. The vertical shaft they had entered through was no longer empty. Dr. Thorne had moved a heavy crane over the opening. He wasn't trying to rescue them. He was trying to cap the hole. He's sealing the exit. Henry realized. If we hit that cap at this speed, we'll be crushed against the lid. The airlock vent. Mr. Miller pointed to a small toggle. If you vent the air now, you'll slow our ascent. It'll act like a brake. Henry grabbed the toggle and pulled. A massive plume of bubbles erupted from the top of the bell. Their upward momentum slowed, the needle on the gauge dropping back toward the surface level. They slowed just enough to see the iron cap loom over them. The top of the diving bell bumped against the iron lid with a dull clang. They were trapped at the surface, just inches below the air, but locked in a metal cage. Henry looked at the silver cylinder he had taken from the pedestal. He noticed a small, recessed button on the bottom. Rose, Miller, get down. I think the second seal isn't just an archive. I think it's a signal. He pressed the button. A piercing, high-frequency sound, like 1,000 glass flutes, erupted from the cylinder. Suddenly, the iron lid above them didn't just move, it disintegrated. A team of people they didn't recognize, dressed in local police uniforms but moving with military precision, were pulling the cap away. Get them out! A voice shouted from above. As the hatch was hauled open and the cold, fresh night air hit Henry's face, he saw a woman standing at the edge of the pit. She wore a badge that didn't say sheriff. It said Federal Bureau of Historical Integrity. Thorne was already in handcuffs, looking older and much more defeated than he had an hour ago. Mr. Henry. Miss Green. The woman asked, reaching down to help them up. I'm Agent Vance. We've been tracking Dr. Thorne for 3 years. I believe you have something that belongs to the public record. The night air felt incredibly thin and sweet after the pressurized environment of the submerged library. Henry sat on the back of a black SUV, a wool blanket draped over his shivering shoulders. The tannery ruins were now a hive of activity, flooded with blue and red strobe lights that reflected off the churning Blackwood River. Agent Vance stood nearby, her eyes fixed on the silver cylinder Henry still clutched. You realize what you found, don't you? Vance asked, her voice calm but serious. She wasn't like Thorn, she didn't look at the artifacts with greed, but with a weary sense of responsibility. It's not just land deeds, Henry said, his voice raspy from the cold. The second seal is a ledger. It tracks the movement of capital from this town into a dozen others. The Silent weren't a local conspiracy. They were a network. Rose sat next to him, holding her father's journal like a shield. My father knew. He wasn't just hiding a treasure. He was hiding a roadmap of the corruption. That's why they had to remove him. Vance nodded. Thorn was part of a group that calls itself the Aletheia Foundation. They claim to be dedicated to historical truth, but they specialize in recovering assets that have been lost to time, usually by seizing them from underprotected municipalities. If they had gotten that cylinder, they would have had the legal leverage to claim half the property in the valley. She stepped closer, extending a gloved hand. I need to take that as evidence, Henry. But I promise you, once the encryption is broken and the names are verified, the truth will be made public. Your town will finally own itself again. Henry looked at the silver cylinder. He thought about Mr. Miller, who was currently being checked over by a medic. He thought about the dangerous descent and the way the glass had spider-webbed under the pressure. He handed it to her. Just make sure it doesn't end up in another vault where nobody can see it. That's not how we work, Vance replied. She signaled to one of her agents, who carefully placed the cylinder in a foam-lined case. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a pale orange glow over the ruins, Henry felt a strange sense of loss. The mystery that had defined his life for months was being packed into crates and loaded onto trucks. It's not over, is it? Rose asked, looking at the departing vehicles. No, Henry said, watching the water. The submerged library was gone, lost to the deep silt of the riverbed. Thorn was just a symptoms. The ledger mentions other towns, other seals. This town was just the beginning. Mr. Miller walked over, leaning heavily on his cane but looking remarkably spirited. Well, my boy, I suppose the bookshop is going to feel rather quiet tomorrow morning. I don't think so, Mr. Miller, Henry said with a small smile. I think people are going to have a lot of questions, and we're the only ones with the library left to answer them. As they walked back toward the town, the morning light revealed something they hadn't noticed before. Etched into the base of the town's welcome sign was a tiny, familiar symbol, the eye and the scales. The Silent might have been exposed, but their mark was everywhere. The quiet of the town following the federal intervention was deceptive. While the sirens had faded and the black SUVs had departed for the city, a heavy, unspoken tension lingered in the air. Henry spent the first few days back at Miller's Books in a state of hyper-awareness. Every creak of the floorboards and every stranger who lingered too long at the window felt like a piece of a puzzle that refused to be finished. Rose had retreated to her father's old study, surrounded by the recovered letters and the maps. She was looking for a pattern, a trail that led away from the river and toward the next town in the valley. Oak Haven. Henry, come look at this, Rose said one afternoon, her voice echoing from the back room. Henry set down a crate of new arrivals and joined her. She had spread a large-scale map of the county across the table. She had used a red string to connect their town to Oak Haven, and then to a third location further north called Stonebridge. The silver cylinder mentioned the triad of the founders. Rose explained, pointing at the 3 points. If our town was knowledge and the submerged library was the archive, Oak Haven was industry. My father's notes mention an old foundry there that was shut down in the 50s. And Stonebridge? Henry asked. Stonebridge was commerce. It's where the regional bank was founded. But look at the alignment. Rose drew a line through the three towns. It formed a perfect isosceles triangle. In the exact center of that triangle was a blank spot on the map, a heavily forested area known as the Blind Woods. Henry leaned over the map. Nothing is ever truly blank with these people. If there's a blank spot, it's because someone paid to have it left off the charts. He pulled out the brass tool from the green box, the one he had used as a whistle in the library. He noticed that the tip of the tool had a small, triangular indentation. He pressed it onto the center of the triangle on the map. It didn't do anything, but the realization hit him. The marks. Henry whispered. We found the eye in the library. We found the scales in the shop. We haven't found the third mark. We need to go to Oak Haven. Henry said. If Thorne's people are still out there, and I don't think Agent Vance caught all of them, they'll be heading for the foundry. Mr. Miller entered the room, his face grave. He was holding a local newspaper, but it wasn't the front-page story about the federal raid that caught Henry's eye. It was a small obituary in the corner. The head of the Oak Haven Historical Society died last night. Miller said softly. An accidental fall in the old foundry. He was an old friend of Thomas's. He was the one who was supposed to be guarding the second triad key. The room grew cold. The game hadn't stopped. It had simply moved to the next board. The Silent were cleaning up their witnesses before the federal government could reach them. We leave for Oak Haven at dawn. Henry said, his hand tightening on the edge of the table. We can't wait for Vance to get permission to cross county lines. By the time the paperwork is done, the foundry will be a pile of ashes. Rose nodded, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and determination. She grabbed her coat and her father's journal. They weren't just librarians anymore. They were the only ones left who knew the sequence of the locks. The drive to Oak Haven was a journey through a landscape of fading industrial ghosts. As the trio crossed the county line, the lush greenery of their hometown gave way to grey hills and skeletons of rusted machinery. Oak Haven had once been the beating heart of the valley's manufacturing. But when the Blackwood Ironworks closed in the 1950s, the town had slowly begun to fold in on itself. The air tastes like copper, Rose remarked, looking out the window at the looming smokestacks. My father's notes say that the ironworks weren't just a factory. They were the forge of the Silent. Everything they built, the clock tower's gears, the diving bell's hull, was cast right here. They pulled up to the gates of the foundry. The sign, barely hanging by a single rusted bolt, read, Blackwood Ironworks. No unauthorized entry. Behind the chain-link fence sat a gargantuan structure of soot-stained brick and corrugated iron. Henry stepped out of the car, carrying a heavy toolkit. He looked at the massive doors of the main casting floor. The Oak Haven archivist, Mr. Sterling, was found near the Great Wheel. That's the primary drive system for the entire facility. We have to be careful, Mr. Miller warned, staying by the car to keep watch. If the Alethea Foundation is involved, they'll have scouts nearby. Henry, Rose, take the back entrance. It's a service tunnel used for coal delivery. Inside, the foundry was a cathedral of rust. The ceiling was so high it was lost in the shadows, and the smell of ancient oil and cold iron was overwhelming. In the center of the hall stood the Great Wheel, a massive iron gear nearly 30 feet in diameter. It was connected to a series of drive shafts that disappeared into the floor. Henry approached the central hub of the wheel. He noticed that the teeth of the gear weren't uniform. Some were notched with small, precise grooves. Rose, look at the hub. Henry whispered. There's a slot here. It's shaped like a triangle, just like the indentation on the brass tool. Rose reached into her bag, but as she pulled out the tool, a low, metallic clanging echoed from the gantry above them. Someone was up there. They froze, looking up into the maze of catwalks and steam pipes. A figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't one of Thorne's tactical team. It was a young man, barely older than Henry, dressed in a grease-stained jumpsuit. He held a heavy wrench, but his expression wasn't one of aggression. It was pure, unadulterated terror. "You're too late," the young man said, his voice shaking. "They already took the blueprint. They're going to restart the furnace." "Who took it?" Henry asked, stepping forward cautiously. "The men in the gray suits." The boy replied, "They said the industry must wake up. If that furnace hits peak temperature, the pressure valves in the town's water main will explode. It's a failsafe, a purge of the surface." Henry looked at the great wheel. The mystery had just scaled up. They weren't just looking for a ledger anymore. They were trying to prevent a catastrophic mechanical failure that could level half of Oak Haven. The air in the foundry changed instantly. A deep, low-frequency thrumming began to vibrate through the soot-covered floorboards, and a smell like burning coal and ancient sulfur filled the hall. Far at the end of the casting floor, the massive, brick-lined furnace, a relic that had been cold for 70 years, glowed with a faint, sickly orange light. "How is it even possible?" Rose asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "A furnace that size takes days to preheat." "Not this one," the boy, Leo, whispered. "It's a geothermal induction furnace. It doesn't just burn coal, it taps into the volcanic vents deep beneath the valley. They've bypassed the governors. The pressure is building directly into the town's auxiliary steam lines." Henry looked at the great wheel. The brass tool was still in his hand. If the furnace reached critical temperature, the steam wouldn't just power the foundry. It would act like a battering ram against the old water mains of Oak Haven. "We have to vent the main line," Henry said, moving toward the great wheel. "Leo, if the blueprint showed the pressure release sequence, where is the manual override?" "It's not a lever," Leo said, pointing up toward the ceiling. "It's the governor's cage. It's a series of brass spheres that spin to regulate the flow. But the men in gray, they chained them shut." Henry didn't hesitate. He thrust the triangular end of the brass tool into the hub of the great wheel. It clicked into place perfectly. "Rose, help me. We need to rotate this clockwise to engage the secondary drive." Together, they threw their weight against the massive iron spokes. For a heart-stopping moment, the wheel didn't move. The rust of 7 decades held firm. But then, with a screech of metal that sounded like a dying giant, the wheel groaned and turned an inch. "Again!" Henry shouted. High above them, on the narrow catwalks, a door slammed open. 2 men in charcoal suits stepped out, silhouetted against the growing orange glare of the furnace. One of them held a radio. The other held a long, suppressed pistol. "Get away from the wheel!" the man shouted. His voice was cold, devoid of the theatricality Thorne had used. These were the workers, the ones who cleared the path. "The pressure is at 90%. Leo screamed, looking at a vibrating gauge on the wall. "The pipes are going to blow." Henry looked at Rose. Her face was smudged with grease, her eyes fierce. "Keep turning. Henry, don't stop." As the wheel began to spin faster, the iron chains connected to the ceiling started to move. The great wheel wasn't just a gear, it was a winch. As it turned, a heavy iron plate in the floor began to slide away, revealing a vertical shaft of white, hissing steam. A bullet sparked off the iron spoke inches from Henry's hand. He didn't flinch. He gave the wheel one final, violent shove. The great wheel locked into place, and a massive brass valve deep in the shaft began to turn. With a roar that shook the entire foundry, a pillar of steam erupted from the safety vent on the roof, shooting hundreds of feet into the night sky. The purge had been diverted. The pressure gauge needle began to drop, trembling as it moved away from the red zone. The men on the catwalk began to descend rapidly, their faces twisted in fury. They had lost the purge, but they still had the intruders trapped in the iron heart. The roar of the steam vent was deafening, a white-hot scream that echoed through the hollow ribcage of the foundry. Beneath the noise, the metallic ping of bullets striking the great wheel's iron spokes provided a lethal percussion. Henry and Rose dove behind the central hub as the two men in charcoal suits reached the lower gantry, their weapons raised with cold, practiced efficiency. "The side door is blocked," Leo shouted, his voice barely audible over the steam. He was huddled behind a stack of rusted casting molds. "But there's an old service lift, the pneumatic hoist. It leads to the subterranean cooling tunnels." Henry looked at the great wheel. The brass tool was still wedged in the hub, vibrating under the immense pressure of the steam lines. "We can't leave the tool. It's the only thing keeping the manual override engaged. If we don't move, we're dead anyway." Rose grabbed Henry's arm, pulling him toward a small, iron-caged platform at the edge of the pit. The lead gunman reached the floor, his boots clattering on the metal grating. He didn't run. He walked, confident in his position. He signaled his partner to flank them from the left. These weren't just security guards. They were cleanup crews for the Alethea Foundation. Henry saw a heavy iron lever near the hoist. It was labeled in faded German script. "Emergency exit. Steam pressure." He realized the hoist didn't use electricity. It used the very steam they had just vented. The lift operates on a pressure differential piston. To descend rapidly, the internal cylinder must be purged, allowing the exterior steam pressure to push the platform down. "Jump in," Henry yelled. Rose and Leo scrambled into the cage. Henry reached out, his fingers brushing the hot brass tool. He couldn't leave it. He gave it a violent twist and a pull. It snapped free just as a bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing through his coat. He tumbled into the cage and slammed the iron gate shut. He pulled the lever. With a violent hiss, the floor beneath them dropped. It wasn't a fall, it was a launch. The pressure of the steam hit the top of the piston, and the cage plummeted into the darkness of the cooling tunnels. The gunman fired a final, useless volley through the floorboards above, but the intruders were already gone, swallowed by the earth. The cage hit the bottom with a jarring thud that sent Henry and Rose sprawling. The air here was freezing, a sharp contrast to the furnace above. It smelled of wet stone and ancient, stagnant water. "Is everyone okay?" Rose asked, her voice shaking as she sat up. "I think my ribs are intact." Leo groaned, rubbing his side. "But we're in the deep cooling tunnels. These lead directly under the Oak Haven riverbed. If they turn the main pumps back on, we'll be drowned in seconds." Henry stood up, clicking on his flashlight. The beam illuminated a tunnel lined with smooth, white tiles, a stark difference from the rough brickwork of the foundry above. At the end of the tunnel was a heavy iron door with a small, circular window. As they approached the door, Henry saw a shadow move behind the glass. It wasn't a gunman. It was an old man, his face thin and pale, wearing a tattered lab coat that had once been white. He was frantically typing on a massive, brass-encrusted mechanical keyboard. "Mr. Sterling." Rose gasped. "The paper said you were dead." The old man turned, his eyes wide and frantic. "Dead? No. No. They just needed me to think I was. They needed the foundry ghost to keep the induction core running. But you stopped the purge." He looked at the brass tool in Henry's hand. "You have the key of industry. But you don't understand. The purge wasn't just to destroy the town. It was a signal to wake the third mark in Stonebridge. Mr. Sterling's hands flew across the brass-encrusted keyboard with a speed that defied his age. The device wasn't a computer in any modern sense. It was a mechanical logic engine, a massive array of clicking gears, sliding rods, and punched metal cards that filled the back wall of the cooling chamber. Every time he struck a key, a series of bells chimed deep within the machine, and a new set of coordinates appeared on a scrolling parchment. They didn't just want the furnace for the purge, Sterling said, his voice cracking. The heat from the induction core was the power source for the Alethea engine. This machine is the brain of the triad. It calculates the financial equilibrium of the valley. By stopping the steam, you've caused a logic error. The system is trying to rebalance itself by dumping all assets into the third mark. Henry looked at the flickering lights on the engine. You mean the money? The deeds? Everything? Sterling nodded frantically. The scales in Stonebridge aren't just a symbol. It's a massive, automated banking vault that operates on weight and pressure. When the engine senses a failure in industry, or knowledge, it triggers a liquidation protocol. It's moving the wealth into a dark account that only the Foundation can access. Rose stepped forward, looking at the scrolls. Can we stop the transfer from here? No, Sterling said, grabbing a satchel filled with punch cards. The link is one way, but I can give you the override sequence. Without it, Stonebridge will detect you as an imbalance and seal the vault permanently, with you inside. The Alethea engine maintains a perfect ratio between the three pillars. If one fails, the others compensate to protect the legacy. Suddenly, a deep, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the white-tiled walls. It wasn't the furnace this time. It was the sound of the massive river intake pumps. They've turned the cooling system back on, Leo shouted, pointing at the iron door. Water began to spray through the seams of the frame. The Foundation is trying to drown the evidence. And us. Henry grabbed Sterling's arm. Is there another way out? The overflow flue, Sterling said, pointing to a circular grate high on the wall. It leads to the old irrigation canals. It's a tight squeeze, and if the water reaches the intake level before we're out, we don't have a choice, Henry said. They scrambled toward the grate. Henry used the key of industry to pry the metal bars loose. He boosted Rose up first, then Leo. As Henry helped the frail Mr. Sterling into the dark pipe, a wall of freezing river water burst through the main door, slamming into the logic engine with the force of a tidal wave. The machine let out a final, discordant chime of gears breaking as the water shorted the mechanical sensors. Henry scrambled into the pipe just as the room below was swallowed by the Blackwood River. They crawled through the dark, cramped flue for what felt like hours, the sound of rushing water echoing behind them. Finally, the pipe opened into a concrete basin on the outskirts of Oak Haven. They collapsed onto the grass, shivering and soaked, as the sun began to rise over the smoking chimneys of the foundry. We have the sequence, Rose said, clutching the punch cards Sterling had saved. And we have the key, Henry added, looking at the brass tool. But Stonebridge is a fortress. We're going to need more than luck to get into a bank designed by the Silent. Stonebridge was a town that lived up to its name, while Oak Haven was a skeleton of iron. Stonebridge was a monolith of granite and marble. It was the financial anchor of the valley, a place where the streets were paved with a clean, surgical precision. At its center stood the Stonebridge Trust and Savings, a neoclassical fortress that looked less like a bank and more like a tomb for the living. The architecture here is designed to intimidate, Mr. Miller observed as they pulled their borrowed truck into a side street. He was exhausted, but his eyes were sharp. In the 1920s, the founders used Stonebridge to launder the profits from the foundry and the library's research. It's the scales, the place where the value of a man's life was weighed against the town's progress. Henry looked at the punch cards in his hand. Sterling had explained that the bank was built atop a series of hydraulic balance scales. The vault didn't just have a combination. It had a weight requirement. To enter, the pressure in the floor sensors had to match a specific logic constant held by the Alethea engine. The liquidation protocol is already running, Rose said, checking her father's watch. According to Sterling's cards, the Foundation is moving the Founders Trust into a ghost account called SB03. Once that transfer hits 100%, the vault's manual overrides will be permanently severed. They approached the back entrance, a service door hidden behind a row of majestic stone pillars. Henry used the brass tool, now acting as the key of industry, to bypass the external tumblers. The door hissed open, revealing a hallway lined with polished brass pipes and pressure gauges. The vault is 3 levels down, Henry whispered. But the floor isn't solid. It's a floating platform balanced on water cylinders. If we don't stand in the right spots, the scales will tilt, and the alarm will trigger. They reached the main antechamber. Before them sat a massive circular door, 30 feet across, made of stainless steel and glass. Through the glass, they could see the internal workings, a series of gold-plated weights hanging from silver chains. Henry, look at the floor, Rose said, pointing to 3 faint symbols etched into the marble: the eye, the gear, and the scales. We have to stand on them simultaneously. Henry took the gear. Rose took the eye. Mr. Miller, leaning on his cane, moved to the scales. As they stepped onto the tiles, the room groaned. The sound of rushing water echoed from beneath the floor as the hydraulic cylinders adjusted to their weight. The vault door didn't spin. It sank. The massive steel circle lowered into the floor, revealing the inner sanctum. Inside, the vault was not filled with gold bars. It was filled with thousands of small, glass vials containing clear liquid, each tagged with a name and a date. And in the center, a man in a charcoal suit stood at a terminal, his fingers flying across a keyboard. It wasn't Silas or a gunman. It was Dr. Aries Thorne. He had escaped the federal agents, his face bruised but his expression one of absolute triumph. "You're late," Thorne said, without looking up. "The liquidation is at 98%. In 2 minutes, the silent will become the invisible, and their wealth will be scattered into the digital ether where no government can ever touch it. Not if we use the override," Henry said, holding up Sterling's punch cards. Thorne turned, a cold smile playing on his lips. "The override requires 3 keys. Henry, you have the eye and the gear, but you're missing the 3rd mark." The hum of the vault was no longer a low vibration. It was a high-pitched whine of digital and mechanical systems pushed to their limits. The screen on Thorne's terminal flickered with a bright, clinical blue. 99% complete. The invisible account was seconds away from becoming the largest shadow fund in history. "The 3rd mark," Thorne sneered, glancing at the heavy stainless steel doors behind them. "You think your little scavenger hunt through the ruins of Oak Haven was enough?" The founders were obsessed with the number 3, but they were more obsessed with total equilibrium. "You have the keys of knowledge and industry. But commerce. Commerce requires the sacrifice of the protector." He pointed a gloved finger at Mr. Miller. "Why do you think he's still here? Henry. Why did Thomas leave a frail old man to watch over his daughter? Because the 3rd mark isn't a tool. It's a biometric weight." Henry felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He looked at the floor sensors they were currently standing on. The hydraulic system wasn't just measuring weight. It was measuring the specific displacement of the 3 bloodlines associated with the triad. "Miller isn't just a librarian," Thorne continued, his voice echoing in the sterile vault. "He's the last of the Stonebridge lineage. The scales won't balance because he's dying. His weight is insufficient. The system senses the imbalance and is accelerating the transfer to save the assets. That's not true, Rose said, her voice trembling but fierce. She stepped off the eye sensor. The room lurched, and a red alarm light began to strobe. The system doesn't want blood. It wants equilibrium. Henry looked at the punch cards Sterling had given them. He saw a line of code he hadn't understood before. Henry realized, his eyes widening. It's the green box. He grabbed the wooden box from Rose. He remembered the small silver plate with the initials TG and the tiny brass dial they had used earlier. He looked at the central pedestal where the terminal sat. There was a small, circular depression in the marble, shaped exactly like the base of the box. Thorn, you're looking for a person. Henry shouted over the rising alarm. But Thomas Green was an engineer of the soul. He knew Miller would get old. He knew his daughter would be smaller than him. He balanced the system with the box. Henry slammed the green box into the depression. Inside the box, the hidden weights shifted. The third mark wasn't a symbol. It was the physical lead and gold lining of the box itself, designed to perfectly compensate for the missing mass of the Green and Miller bloodlines. The floor groaned. The red lights stopped strobing. The blue screen on Thorn's terminal froze at 99.9%. No! Thorn screamed, lunging for the box. Henry tackled him, the two men crashing into the brass piping. At that moment, the central vault pillar began to rotate. The liquidation protocol didn't just stop, it reversed. The thousands of glass vials in the racks began to glow with a soft amber light. The wealth wasn't being scattered, it was being locked down. The override! Rose yelled, shoving the punch cards into the manual reader at the side of the pedestal. The machine let out a series of clicks and bells, the same melody they had heard in Oak Haven. The terminal screen turned green. Transaction cancelled. Assets secured to Municipal Trust. Thorn slumped against the wall, defeated. He looked at the green box, then at the three of them. You've stopped the transfer, but you haven't stopped the foundation. They are already in the blind woods. The scales were just the bank. The central core, that's where they're going now. The blind woods? Henry asked, pulling Thorn up by his collar. What's in the center of the triangle? Thorn gave a hollow laugh. The reason the silent was silent in the first place. The clock of the world. The Stonebridge police arrived just as the vault's secondary airlocks engaged, sealing Thorn and his remaining digital trackers inside the secure zone for federal pickup. But Henry, Rose, and Mr. Miller didn't wait for the statements or the handshakes. Thorn's final words about the clock of the world had turned the blind woods from a map vacancy into a ticking bomb. The blind woods aren't just unmapped because of the trees, Mr. Miller said as they sped toward the center of the triad. They're unmapped because of the magnetic interference. My father used to say the birds wouldn't fly over the center of the valley. He thought it was iron deposits. But he was wrong. It was the machinery. As they drove, the scenery shifted from the sterile marble of Stonebridge to an oppressive, ancient forest. The trees here were massive, their bark twisted into patterns that looked unnervingly like gears and coils. The further they drove, the more Henry's compass spun wildly, the needle unable to find north. We have to go on foot, Henry said, pulling the truck onto a moss-covered shoulder. The electronics are going to fry if we get any closer. The air in the blind woods was unnaturally still. There was no birdsong, no rustle of leaves, only a rhythmic, subterranean thump that felt like a giant's heartbeat. Henry checked the brass tool. The triangular end was vibrating in his palm, humming in a frequency that matched the ground's tremor. Look at the trees, Rose whispered. She pointed to a massive oak. Embedded in its trunk was a thick copper cable, overgrown with bark but pulsing with a faint blue light. These cables ran like veins through the forest, all leading toward a single point. They reached a clearing where the trees stopped abruptly, forming a perfect circle. In the center was not a building, but a massive crater lined with mirrors and brass reflectors. At the bottom of the crater sat a device that defied every law of 20th century horology. A clock face the size of a cathedral, lying flat against the earth. The Grand Orrery Specifications. The clock of the world is a geomechanical orrery. It doesn't track minutes. It tracks the tectonic and atmospheric shifts of the entire valley. Primary drive. Geothermal pressure from the Oak Haven induction core. Logic hub. Data streams from the Stonebridge hydraulic sensors. Safety governor. The clock tower mechanism in the town square. It's a regulator. Henry realized, standing on the edge of the crater, the three towns weren't just for money or industry. They were the stabilizers for this thing. The silent were keeping the valley from tearing itself apart. Or they were controlling when it does. Rose added, pointing to the center of the clock face. A group of men in tactical gear were already there. But they weren't Alethea. They wore different insignias. Dark, circular patches with a white mountain. They were the guardians of the core, the inner circle of the silent who had been waiting for the triad to fail. In the center of the giant clock, a massive brass pillar began to rise. It wasn't a hand, it was a needle, and it was pointing directly at the sun. They're initiating the Great Reset. Mr. Miller whispered, his face pale. If they align that needle with the solar noon, the geothermal pressure will be released all at once. It won't just be a purge. It will be an earthquake that flattens every town in the valley. Henry looked at the brass tool. He saw a final, hidden slot on the handle. It wasn't a key for a door. It was a fuse. The heat radiating from the crater was intense, a shimmering wall of distorted air that smelled of ozone and baked clay. The massive brass needle at the center of the clock of the world continued its slow, mechanical ascent, clicking with the sound of 1,000 iron hammers. The men in the white mountain patches ignored the heat, their eyes fixed on the sky. 20 minutes until solar noon. Henry whispered, checking his own watch. It was the only mechanical device still working. The quartz watches of the tactical team had likely fried miles ago. If that needle hits the zenith, the geothermal bypass opens. The pressure we diverted in Oak Haven has been building in the crust ever since. It has nowhere else to go. We can't just charge down there. Rose said, her hand on the brass tool in Henry's pocket. They have the high ground and the firepower. We need a way to disrupt the alignment without triggering the failsafe. Henry looked at the mirrors lining the crater. They weren't just for show. They were parabolic concentrators. They were designed to focus solar energy into a central receiver at the base of the needle, using the heat to expand a volatile liquid that drove the final gear. The mirrors. Henry said, a plan forming. If we can tilt even one of the primary reflectors, the heat won't be uniform. The expansion will be asymmetrical. The needle will jam in the guide sleeve before it reaches the release valve. I'll go for the eastern array. Rose volunteered. Leo, you take the west. Henry, you have to get to the base. If the needle jams, the pressure will need a manual bleed, or the whole thing explodes anyway. Mr. Miller sat back against a tree, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Go. I'll keep watch. If they see you, I'll provide the distraction. Henry didn't like leaving him, but time was a luxury they had already spent. He began to slide down the side of the crater, using the shadows of the massive brass reflectors for cover. The tactical team was preoccupied with the central pillar. Their leader, a man with a scarred face and a voice like grinding stones, barking orders into a heavy radio. Focus the beams. The leader shouted. We need the core temperature at 1200 degrees before the shadow crosses the line. Henry reached the base of the eastern mirror. It was mounted on a massive iron gimbal, greased with the same black oil he'd seen in the clock tower. He looked up and saw Rose reaching her position. She gave a small, sharp whistle. Henry grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from a nearby toolkit. He jammed it into the gimbal's locking gear and heaved. The mirror groaned, its surface shifting just 3 degrees. The effect was immediate. The focused beam of white light, which had been hitting the central receiver, slid to the side, scorching the brass casing of the pillar. The needle let out a high-pitched, metallic shriek. Imbalance. One of the guards screamed. Sector 4 is off axis. The leader turned, his eyes scanning the rim of the crater. He spotted Rose. There. On the ridge. Take her down. Henry didn't wait. He sprinted from behind the mirror toward the central pillar. He had the brass tool, the fuse, and he knew where it had to go. But between him and the pillar stood 3 men with rifles and a world of centuries-old secrets they were willing to kill for. The air in the crater had become a shimmering, lethal haze. As the eastern mirror shifted, the central pillar groaned under the stress of uneven thermal expansion. The tactical team scrambled, their boots echoing against the brass floor of the orrery. Henry sprinted across the open expanse, his heart hammering against his ribs in sync with the subterranean thrum of the valley. Stop him! The scarred leader roared, drawing a sidearm. Henry dove behind a massive bronze counterweight just as a bullet sparked off the metal, singing past his ear. He was 20 feet from the central hub. He could see the small, recessed port, the final interface for the key of the silent. If the sheer stress exceeded the material's yield strength before Henry could bleed the pressure, the pillar would shatter, releasing a localized geothermal explosion. Henry looked up. Rose was pinned behind a reflector, bullets shredding the wood of a nearby crate. He had to draw their fire. He stood up, not to run, but to shout. The reset is failing, you fools. Look at the gauge. The leader glanced at the trembling needle. The vibration was visible now, a violent, side-to-side shudder that threatened to tear the central hub from its moorings. The guards hesitated, their loyalty to the Foundation wavering against the immediate threat of a geothermal breach. Henry used that split second of doubt. He lunged for the hub, sliding on the oil-slicked brass. He reached the port and jammed the brass tool into the slot. He didn't turn it. He pushed it inward. A jet of superheated steam hissed from the base of the pillar, knocking Henry backward. The needle's ascent slowed, then stopped entirely, just inches from the zenith. The high-pitched shriek of the metal faded into a low, steady hiss. You've jammed the regulator. The leader hissed, walking toward Henry with his weapon leveled. You've saved the towns, perhaps, but you've trapped the pressure here. We're standing on a powder keg with a lit fuse. No. Henry panted, wiping grease from his eyes. I didn't jam it. I rerouted it. He pointed to the copper cables running back into the woods. The blue light in the veins wasn't pulsing anymore. It was glowing with a steady, fierce intensity. The Silent built this to control the valley. Henry said. But the trust was built to empower it. I sent the pressure back through the lines to the Oak Haven Foundry and the Stonebridge vaults. The energy isn't going to explode. It's going to power the new municipal grid. You just gave the town enough free energy to last 1,000 years. The leader's face went pale. He realized his great reset had been turned into a public utility. He raised his gun to fire, but a sharp crack echoed from the rim of the crater. Mr. Miller stood at the top of the ridge, holding an old flare gun. The bright red ball of fire arched over the crater, a signal for the federal teams who had been tracking the energy spike from Stonebridge. Drop it. A voice boomed from the tree line. Agent Vance and her tactical team appeared, their rifles trained on the Guardians. The battle for the heart of the woods was over, but as Henry looked at the glowing cables, he realized the Silent had left one final secret in the code. The brass tool in his hand was still vibrating. The dust in the crater began to settle as Agent Vance's team moved with surgical efficiency, zip-tying the remaining Guardians and securing the perimeter. The clock of the world was quiet now, its massive brass needle frozen like a giant sundial. But in Henry's hand, the brass tool was still humming, a high-pitched, rhythmic throb that felt like a trapped bee. "Henry, your hand is shaking," Rose said, stepping over a discarded rifle to reach him. She looked at the tool. It wasn't just vibrating. The metal itself seemed to be heating up, glowing with a soft, pulsed violet light. "It's not me," Henry muttered, his eyes locked on the device. "It's the tool. It's reacting to something. Now that the main geothermal pressure is rerouted, this thing is acting like a resonant receiver." Henry walked toward the edge of the brass floor, the vibration intensifying as he moved toward the northwest quadrant. He pulled a small notebook and pencil from his pocket, attempting to chart the pulses. "It's a compass," Henry realized, looking back at Mr. Miller, who was being assisted by a federal medic. "But it's not pointing north. It's pointing to the primary hub." The primary hub. Agent Vance joined them, her brow furrowed. "We've already secured the 3 towns and this orrery. What else could there be?" "The triad was a stabilizer," Henry explained, gesturing to the copper veins in the trees. "But a stabilizer needs a command center. If Oakhaven was the muscle and Stonebridge was the blood, there has to be a brain. And it's not in the towns. It's hidden under the roots of this forest." Rose looked at her father's journal, flipping to a page they had previously ignored, a sketch of a tree with roots that formed the shape of a skull. "My father called it the solitude. He said some truths were too heavy for a community to carry. He wrote, 'Where the shadow falls at the solstice, the master gear sleeps.'" Henry followed the tool's vibration, leading them out of the crater and back into the thickest part of the blind woods. About 500 yards away, they found it, an enormous, ancient cedar tree that had been struck by lightning decades ago. Its trunk was hollowed out, but the wood inside wasn't organic. It was painted cast iron. Henry pressed the triangular end of the tool into a knot in the ironwood. With a heavy, hydraulic hiss, the ground between the massive roots began to retract. A staircase made of white porcelain and brass descended into the cool, dark earth. "This is it," Henry whispered. "The final chapter of the silent." "Not the final chapter." A voice crackled over Agent Vance's radio. It was the forensics team back at the Stonebridge vault. "Vance, you need to see this. We just decrypted the final file from Thorne's terminal. The Silent weren't a local group. They are subchapter 14. There are 13 more of these arrays across the globe." Henry looked down into the porcelain darkness. The mystery hadn't just ended. It had just expanded to a global scale. The descent into the solitude was a jarring shift from the chaotic, muddy crater of the orrery. The porcelain stairs were impeccably clean, and the air held a faint, antiseptic scent of ozone and lavender. As Henry, Rose, and Agent Vance reached the bottom, they stepped into a room that looked like the interior of a giant watch. The walls were curved and lined with thousands of tiny, clicking brass switches. In the center of the room stood the master gear, a horizontal wheel of polished obsidian and gold, 6 feet in diameter, spinning with such perfect balance that it made no sound at all. "This is the synchronization hub," Henry whispered, his voice sounding flat in the acoustically dampened room. "It's not just a clock. It's a harmonic oscillator. It kept the frequencies of the other 13 subchapters in alignment." Rose walked toward a massive mahogany desk at the far end of the chamber. On the desk sat a device that looked like a cross between a typewriter and a telegraph. It was clicking rapidly, spitting out a narrow ribbon of paper. "Henry, look at the map," Rose said, her voice tight. Behind the desk, a giant wall map of the world was etched into a sheet of frosted glass. 14 pinpricks of light glowed on its surface. Most were dim, but 3 were pulsing with a violent, angry red. London, Cairo, and Kyoto. The Silent weren't just a local group. Agent Vance said, her fingers tracing the glowing lines connecting the dots. This is a global shadow government. They've been using geothermal, hydraulic, and atmospheric energy to regulate, well, everything. Markets, weather, even political stability. Henry stepped up to the master gear. He noticed that the tool in his hand was vibrating in perfect rhythm with the obsidian wheel. He saw a small, diamond-shaped socket in the center of the gear. Vance, the message from the vault. Henry said without looking back. What did the final file say about the Great Reset? It wasn't just a local earthquake. Henry. Vance replied, her face pale as she read her tablet. If Chapter 14 hit solar noon without the regulators, it would have sent a harmonic shockwave through the entire network. A chain reaction. Every subchapter would have purged simultaneously. It was a global failsafe. A scorched earth policy. Rose breathed. If they couldn't control the world, they were going to reset it to 0. Henry looked at the master gear. It was spinning faster now. The red lights on the map were spreading. By securing the valley, they had saved their home, but they had inadvertently triggered a desynchronization in the rest of the world. The system was trying to compensate for the loss of its heart. We have to stop the master gear. Henry said, if you stop that wheel, you sever the connection. A new voice echoed through the room. They turned to see a screen on the wall flicker to life. It wasn't a live feed, it was a pre-recorded message. An elderly man with a sharp, regal face and a white goatee looked out at them. He wore a signet ring with the eye and the scales. I am Arthur Blackwood. The man said, if you are seeing this, the solitude has been breached. You believe you have saved your valley. In reality, you have broken the seal on a vessel that was never meant to be opened. The 13 remain, and they will not be kind to the town that failed the triad. The screen went black, and the room began to vibrate. Not the low thrum of machinery, but a high-pitched, piercing whistle. The self-destruct. Rose asked. No. Henry said, looking at the master gear. A broadcasting signal. He's calling them here. The high-pitched whistle wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force that vibrated in the marrow of Henry's bones. The master gear, once a silent guardian of the world's equilibrium, had transformed into a shimmering blur of obsidian and gold. The solitude was no longer a sanctuary of secrets. It was a lighthouse, and every shadow hand of the global network was reaching for the light. Comms are dead. Agent Vance shouted, ripping the earpiece from her head. The signal is flooding every frequency. It's a wide-spectrum jammer. Henry gripped the brass tool. The violet light pulsing from its core was now so bright it cast long, flickering shadows against the porcelain walls. He realized that the broadcasting signal wasn't just radio waves. It was a long-wave acoustic resonance being pumped directly into the Earth's crust. Signal analysis. The convergence wave. The broadcasting beacon was operating on a principle of constructive interference. By modulating the master gear's rotation, the Silent were creating a standing wave that would act as a homing beacon for the other 13 sectors. They're not just coming to see what happened. Henry yelled over the rising whistle. They're coming to re-anchor the system. If they get here and find the heart is compromised, they won't just arrest us. They'll purge the entire valley to ensure the solitude remains a secret. Rose was at the mahogany desk, her eyes scanning the rapidly scrolling paper ribbon. The responses are coming in. Henry, look at the status table. 20 minutes. Vance's face went grim. There's a private fleet in the Atlantic. They must have been on standby the moment the clock tower stopped. The Master's strategy. Arthur Blackwood's message wasn't a warning. It was a distraction. While we were looking for the brain, he was setting the trap. The solitude is a locked room, and we just turned the key for the executioners. Henry looked at the diamond-shaped socket in the center of the spinning gear. He felt the weight of the brass tool in his hand. If he inserted the tool now, it would either shatter the mechanism or act as a phase inverter, flipping the signal and potentially blinding the incoming ships. If I miss the timing by even a millisecond, Henry warned, the torque from the gear will snap the tool and probably my arm. You won't miss, Rose said, stepping beside him and placing her hand over his. You've spent your life listening to the rhythm of books and gears. Henry, you know the beat. The room began to shake as the private vessel closed the distance. Above them, in the blind woods, the sound of heavy rotors began to drown out the wind. The silent were no longer whispering. The thrum of the rotors overhead grew into a bone-shaking roar. Dust and debris filtered down through the ventilation shafts of the solitude, casting grit onto the pristine white porcelain floor. Agent Vance checked her sidearm, her eyes fixed on the security monitors. Dark shapes were rappelling from the black-clad helicopters into the blind woods. They're on the ground, Vance reported, her voice tight. Tactical Team 09. These aren't just guards, they're the Silence Elite Erasure Squad. We have maybe 3 minutes before they breach the ironwood hatch. Henry looked at the master gear. The obsidian wheel was now a blur of terrifying kinetic energy. To stop the signal, he didn't need to break the machine. He needed to turn it against itself. Rose, I need you to watch the oscillations on the logic engine, Henry shouted over the scream of the machinery. The moment the wave hits its peak, I'm going to insert the tool. We're going to flip the phase by exactly 180 degrees. The physics of silence. To achieve destructive interference, the inverted signal must be exactly out of phase with the original broadcasting wave. This would effectively zero out the homing beacon, making the solitude invisible to the incoming fleet. Henry braced his feet against the base of the gear. His hands, though slick with sweat, were steady. Rose leaned over the scrolling paper, her finger tracking the jagged peaks of the resonance. Wait for it, Rose called out, her eyes wide. The Kyoto frequency is merging. The amplitude is doubling. Now. Henry. Now. Henry lunged forward, thrusting the diamond-tipped brass tool into the center of the spinning obsidian. There was a sound like a lightning strike. A flash of violet light erupted from the socket, throwing Henry and Rose backward. The master gear didn't stop, but its pitch changed instantly from a piercing whistle to a low, guttural growl. The violet light didn't fade. It began to flow out of the gear, traveling along the copper veins in the walls. On the frosted glass map, the 13 red dots flickered. The lines connecting them began to warp and dissolve. It's working, Vance breathed, looking at her tablet. The signal isn't just dead, it's scrambled. The incoming ships just lost their GPS, their sonar, and their internal comms. They're flying blind in a storm of their own making. But the victory was short-lived. A heavy explosion rocked the chamber, sending a shower of porcelain tiles from the ceiling. The Erasure Squad hadn't used the stairs. They had used thermal charges to blow through the cooling vents. 3 figures in matte black armor dropped into the room, their visors glowing with a cold, predatory blue light. They didn't carry rifles. They carried high-frequency sonic projectors, weapons designed to shatter bone and glass alike. The tool. The lead commando synthesized through his helmet. Give us the key of the silent, and we will make your reset quick. Henry stood up, pulling Rose behind him. He reached for the master gear, his hand hovering over the tool. He realized that the phase inversion hadn't just blinded the enemy. It had turned the entire solitude into a giant, resonant weapon. You want the frequency? Henry asked, his voice low and dangerous. Then you can have all of it. The air in the solitude didn't just vibrate, it became a visible medium of destruction. The three commandos raised their sonic projectors, the barrels glowing with a lethal blue hum. But Henry didn't pull the brass tool out of the master gear. Instead, he twisted it deeper into the obsidian socket, feeling the torque of the world's heart vibrating up his spine. The phase inversion isn't just a shield. Rose. Henry yelled over the roar. It's an accumulator. Every pulse the Kyoto and London sectors send is being stored in the Gi's inertia. The lead commando fired. A localized shockwave of high-frequency sound blasted toward Henry, intended to liquefy the air in his lungs. Henry yanked the brass tool to the far left. The master gear let out a metallic scream as the stored kinetic energy was released in a focused harmonic counterpulse. The two waves collided in the center of the room. The result wasn't a bang, but a ripple in reality that shattered the porcelain tiles and turned the commando's sonic projectors into useless slag. The men in black armor were thrown back against the curved walls, their visors flickering and dying as the electronics fried. "Vance! Now!" Henry gasped, his hands burning from the friction of the tool. Agent Vance didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, using the confusion to disarm the fallen soldiers and secure their biometric tethers. "Systems clear," she shouted. "But the master gear is overheating. Henry, if you don't release the friction, the obsidian is going to shatter." "I can't release it yet." Henry pointed at the frosted glass map. The 13 red dots were no longer just pulsing. They were spinning in chaotic circles. "The network is trying to rehome the signal. If I pull the key now, the energy will backflow and trigger the Great Reset in every sector simultaneously. We have to globalize the shutdown." Rose scrambled back to the mahogany desk, her fingers flying through the discarded punch cards from Oak Haven. The industry code. "Henry, the Oak Haven cards had a sequence for a total vacuum. If we send that command through the master gear, it will tell the other 13 sectors that the atmosphere is gone. They'll all enter safe mode." "Do it." Henry braced himself. The master gear was glowing cherry red now, the smell of hot oil and scorched obsidian filling the room. Rose shoved the Oak Haven cards into the Solitude's logic engine. A series of deep, mournful bells rang out, not 3 times, but 13. One by one, the red dots on the map turned a steady, peaceful green. London, Cairo, Kyoto. The lights dimmed and faded. The global shadow was finally going to sleep. With a final, violent jerk, Henry pulled the brass tool from the socket. The master gear slowed, its terrifying momentum dissipating into a low, melodic hum before finally coming to a dead stop. Silence, absolute and heavy, fell over the solitude. "Is it over?" Rose asked, her voice barely a whisper in the sudden quiet. Henry looked at the brass tool. It was bent, scorched, and cold. "The network is down, but we're still 40 feet underground, and I think I just heard the main hatch lock from the outside." The absolute silence of the solitude was more unnerving than the roar of the machinery. Henry, Rose, and Agent Vance stood in the dim amber light of the emergency lanterns, their shadows stretching long across the shattered porcelain floor. The master gear sat motionless, a dark monolith of obsidian that had nearly cost them their lives. "The external hatch is dead-bolted," Vance said, returning from the base of the stairs. She holstered her weapon, her face etched with exhaustion. "Electronic overrides are fried from the phase inversion. And those commandos, they were on a one-way trip. They don't have the keys." Henry walked to the curved wall, his fingers tracing the thousands of tiny brass switches. He wasn't looking for a light switch. He was looking for the architecture of the exit. The Silent were obsessed with redundancy. A command center like this wouldn't have just one way out, especially not if the master was inside during a purge. Rose was still at the mahogany desk, her eyes fixed on a small, hidden compartment that had popped open when the gear stopped. Inside was a single, heavy key made of cold, blue steel. Not brass, not gold. "Henry, look," she said, holding it up. "The initials on this one aren't TG. They're AB. Arthur Blackwood." Henry whispered. He took the key, noticing it felt significantly heavier than its size suggested. The founder's personal bypass. He looked at the floor directly beneath the master gear. Now that the obsidian wheel was still, he could see a faint, circular seam in the porcelain. It wasn't a drain, it was a circular vault door. The gravity lock mechanism. The final gate of the Solitude doesn't operate on steam or electricity. It uses a counterweighted gravity lock. To disengage the radial bars, the key must be turned while a specific pressure is applied to the center of the gear. "We need weight," Henry said. "More than just the three of us." He looked at the unconscious commandos in their heavy tactical armor. "Vance, help me move them onto the gear. We need to hit the pressure threshold to trigger the gravity release." Together, they dragged the heavy figures onto the obsidian wheel. As the weight increased, the floor let out a deep, sonorous clunk. The blue steel key in Henry's hand began to glow with a faint internal light, as if recognizing its home. Henry knelt in the center of the gear, found the hidden keyhole, and inserted the AB key. He turned it. Instead of a click, there was a low, melodic chime, the sound of 100 silver bells ringing at once. The master gear didn't spin. It descended. The entire center of the room sank slowly into a new shaft, revealing a tunnel lined with smooth, white river stones. The air that drifted up from the tunnel didn't smell like ozone or lavender. It smelled like damp earth and pine needles. "It's a passage to the riverbank," Rose said, her voice filled with hope. The silent always had a way to disappear into the water. As they stepped into the tunnel, Henry looked back at the Solitude one last time. The frosted glass map was dark. The global network was silent. They had cut the strings of the world's puppet masters, but as he looked at the blue steel key in his hand, he felt a strange vibration. "Wait," Henry said, stopping at the threshold. "The map, one light is still on." He pointed back into the room. In the far corner of the glass, in a location that didn't correspond to any known city, somewhere in the middle of the Antarctic ice shelf, a single, tiny white was pulsing. It wasn't red or green. It was white. The North Star. Mr. Miller's voice echoed from the top of the stairs. He had limped down, supported by a medic. The silent didn't start in the towns. "Henry." They started at the pole. Henry gripped the key. The mystery had reached its final gate, but the path ahead was frozen. The white stone tunnel led them out onto the banks of the Blackwood River just as the first light of dawn broke over the valley. The air was crisp and carried the scent of pine and freedom. Behind them, the Solitude remained hidden beneath the roots of the ancient forest, its global heart silenced by a librarian's hands and an engineer's daughter's heart. Federal recovery teams, now under the strict oversight of the Bureau of Historical Integrity, were already cordoning off the blind woods. Dr. Thorne and his associates were being transported to a high-security facility, their dreams of a great reset dismantled. But for Henry, Rose, and Mr. Miller, the victory felt quiet, a heavy, resonant peace that sat in their chests like the steady beat of a well-oiled clock. "The town is waking up," Mr. Miller said, leaning on the railing of the old stone bridge. He looked toward the square, where the clock tower stood tall, its gears now powered by the clean, geothermal energy Henry had rerouted. "They'll never know how close they came to the 0 hour. They'll just see the lights are brighter and the clocks are truer." Henry looked at the blue steel key in his palm. It was no longer vibrating, but it felt cold, colder than the morning air. He thought about the white pulsing dot on the Antarctic map. The final calculation. The apex frequency. Before the master gear stopped. Henry had noted the final frequency being broadcast to the North Star Station. It wasn't a command. It was a handshake protocol. The result suggested a signal capable of penetrating 2 miles of solid ice to reach a facility that, officially, did not exist. "We can't go after it, can we?" Rose asked, standing beside him. Her father's journal was tucked safely in her coat. She looked at the horizon, where the mountains met the sky. "The Bureau will take over the investigation. They have the resources." "The Bureau has the resources," Henry agreed, his eyes reflecting the pale morning sun. "But they don't have the context. They see a conspiracy. We see a machine. My father and yours. They didn't just leave us a mystery. They left us a responsibility." They walked back toward the town, toward Miller's Books. The shop would need to be rebuilt. The history section expanded. The silent had been exposed, but their architecture remained, an invisible skeleton of gears and logic that still governed the world in ways the public couldn't imagine. As they reached the shop door, the town clock chimed. It was a rich, deep sound that echoed through the valley, signaling not just the start of a new day, but the start of a new era. Henry paused at the threshold, looking at the small brass dial on his keychain. The Guardian's Oath. Knowledge must be shared, but protected. Industry must power, but not devour. Commerce must balance, but not weigh the soul. "Henry!" Rose called from inside, where the smell of brewing tea was already fighting back the dampness of the tunnels. "Are you coming in?" "In a minute," Henry replied. He looked at the blue steel key one last time before slipping it into his pocket. He knew the silent weren't truly gone. They were just waiting for the next desynchronization. And when it happened, the librarian of Blackwood Valley would be ready.